The ocean holds secrets that passengers never see. Beyond the champagne fountains and midnight buffets, there exists a world known only to those who work below deck. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the darkest corners of cruise ship life, where staff members have encountered things that no amount of money could make them forget. These stories come from crew members who signed confidentiality agreements, from workers who disappeared mid-contract, and from those who returned to land, vowing never to set foot on a ship again. What you're about to hear has been verified through incident reports, crew testimonials, and investigations that were quietly buried by maritime corporations. These are true horror stories. I signed my contract on a Tuesday in March, barely able to contain my excitement as I boarded the Celestial Horizon for the first time. At 23 years old, this was my escape from a dead-end waitressing job in Tampa, my chance to see the world while earning enough money to finally pay off my student loans. The recruitment video had promised adventure, travel, and the opportunity of a lifetime. What they didn't mention was that some opportunities come with prices you never intended to pay. The ship was magnificent, stretching nearly 1,100 feet from bow to stern, with 15 passenger decks gleaming white against the afternoon sun. I reported to crew services on Deck 2, where a tired-looking woman named Patricia processed my paperwork and handed me my uniform, cabin assignment, and an ID card that would control my entire existence for the next 6 months. My cabin was barely larger than a closet, shared with 3 other stewards who worked opposite shifts. But I didn't care. I was officially crew on a luxury liner that would visit 12 countries over the next half year. Training started immediately. I spent my first week learning the layout of the ship, memorizing passenger deck configurations, studying the intricate system of service corridors that allowed crew to move invisibly throughout the vessel. My supervisor, a stern Filipino woman named Carmen who had worked cruise ships for 17 years, drilled us constantly on procedures, protocols, and the absolute importance of passenger satisfaction. The wealthy guests paying $8,000 per person for this voyage expected perfection, and we were trained to deliver nothing less. It was during my 4th day of training that I first noticed something odd about Deck 3. Carmen was leading our group of new stewards through the service corridors, showing us the most efficient routes between cabin sections. We had just finished inspecting the starboard side cabins when I noticed a corridor branching off to port that wasn't marked on the deck plans we'd been issued. The hallway looked identical to all the others, with the same beige carpeting and numbered cabin doors. But it dead-ended after only 6 doors instead of continuing through to the opposite side of the ship like every other corridor. I pointed it out to Carmen, asking if we were responsible for servicing those cabins. Her expression changed instantly, the professional mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something that looked like fear. She recovered quickly, but I'd seen it. That brief flash of genuine emotion before the practiced composure returned. "Those cabins are not your concern," she said firmly, already moving our group away from the corridor. "Deck 3 starboard only. You will never have reason to go down that hallway." But I'd grown up with 4 older brothers who taught me that being told not to do something was basically an invitation to find out why. During our lunch break, I pulled out the official deck plans we'd been issued and studied Deck 3 carefully. The corridor I'd seen wasn't there. The plans showed the deck as a perfect rectangle with cabins running along both sides and connecting hallways at regular intervals. That dead-end corridor with its 6 mysterious doors simply didn't exist on paper. I asked another trainee, a guy from Michigan named Josh, if he'd noticed anything weird about that corridor. He looked at me like I was crazy and said all the corridors looked the same to him. But when I described the location, something flickered in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or warning. He leaned in closer and lowered his voice. My roommate told me something about Deck 3. He whispered. He's been working ships for 5 years. Says there's a section that senior crew won't talk about. Supposedly someone died there years ago and now it's just storage or something. He said if I ever got assigned to service that area, I should request a transfer immediately. That evening, after training ended at 8 p.m., I couldn't resist. I told myself I was just going to walk past the corridor, maybe peek down the hallway to see what was so mysterious about 6 cabin doors that didn't appear on any official plans. The ship was massive and confusing, and crew members were constantly getting lost during their first weeks. No one would question why I was on Deck 3. The corridor was exactly as I remembered, branching off from the main service hallway like a forgotten limb. The lighting was dimmer here, and I noticed immediately that the air felt different, colder. The climate control on cruise ships was usually aggressive, pumping frigid air through every space to combat the tropical heat. But this was something else. This was the kind of cold that comes from places where warmth has been deliberately excluded. I walked slowly down the corridor, noting that unlike every other hallway on the ship, this one had no emergency exit signs, no fire extinguishers, no safety equipment of any kind. The 6 cabin doors were numbered 309 through 314, which made no sense because according to the deck plans, cabins in the 300 series should be on the opposite side of the ship. These cabins existed in a space that officially wasn't supposed to be here. I was standing in front of cabin 312 when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find Carmen standing at the entrance to the corridor, her expression unreadable in the dim light. We stared at each other for a long moment before she spoke. I told you to stay away from here. I was just exploring. I got lost. No, you didn't. She walked toward me slowly, her footsteps echoing in the narrow space. You're curious. I understand. I was curious too when I first started. But Maria, listen to me very carefully. This corridor is off limits for a reason. The cabins are empty. They've been empty for a long time, and they need to stay that way. Why? What happened here? Carmen glanced at the cabin doors with something that looked like genuine dread. It doesn't matter what happened. What matters is that you never come down here again, especially not after midnight. The things that happen in this corridor after midnight are not things you want to witness. Do you understand me? I wanted to ask more questions, but something in her tone made it clear the conversation was over. She escorted me back to the main service corridor and made me promise I wouldn't return to Deck 3 port side. I promised, of course, but we both knew I was lying. That night, lying in my narrow bunk while my roommates snored in the bunks above and beside me, I couldn't stop thinking about those 6 doors and the way Carmen's voice had trembled when she mentioned midnight. Whatever was happening in that forgotten corridor, it was real enough to frighten a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades working ships. And I was absolutely certain that before my 6-month contract ended, I was going to find out exactly what she was so desperate to keep me from discovering. 3 weeks passed, and I settled into the brutal rhythm of cruise ship life. 14-hour days servicing 32 cabins, smiling through exhaustion, cleaning up after passengers who treated us like we were invisible. I'd almost convinced myself to forget about that corridor on Deck 3. Almost. But every time I walked past that section during my rounds, I felt it calling to me. That cold pocket of air that shouldn't exist. It was a Thursday evening when everything changed. I was finishing my shift, already dreaming about the 6 hours of sleep I might get before starting again at 5 a.m. when Carmen found me in the linen storage room. Her face was pale, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. "Maria," I need you to do something. There's been a passenger complaint about an odor on Deck 3. Management is insisting someone investigate tonight before the guests wake up tomorrow. She handed me a master key card and a pair of industrial cleaning gloves. Cabin 312. My stomach dropped. You said I should never go down there. I know what I said. She was gripping her clipboard so tightly her knuckles had gone white. But this request came from the hotel director himself. Someone has to check it, and all the senior staff are suddenly unavailable. Convenient, right? The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. Just go in. Identify the source of the smell and report back. Don't touch anything. Don't stay longer than necessary. Why that specific cabin? There are 5 others in that corridor. Carmen finally looked at me directly, and what I saw in her eyes made my blood run cold. Because 312 is the only one we still have keys for. The others were sealed years ago, welded shut from the outside. She pressed the key card into my hand. Get in and get out, Maria. And whatever you do, don't go in there after 1 a.m. If you're not finished by then, walk away and tell them you couldn't access the cabin. The corridor was exactly as I remembered, except somehow worse. The temperature had dropped even further, cold enough that I could see my breath in the air. The ship was sailing through the Caribbean, where it was 87 degrees outside. But this hallway felt like a walk-in freezer. The lighting flickered as I approached cabin 312, and I noticed something I'd missed during my first visit. Long scratch marks gouged into the walls on either side of the door, running from about waist height down to the floor, like someone had been dragged, fighting, into the cabin. I checked my watch. 11:40 p.m. Plenty of time to get in and out before whatever Carmen was afraid of started happening. The key card worked on the first try, and the door swung open with a soft click. The smell hit me immediately. Not the sewage or rot I'd expected, but something chemical and wrong, like formaldehyde mixed with decay. The cabin was freezing, at least 20 degrees colder than the already frigid corridor. My breath came out in thick clouds as I stepped inside and found the light switch. The fluorescent bulbs flickered twice before illuminating a scene that made no sense. The cabin looked like someone had been living here recently. A half-empty water bottle sat on the nightstand. A magazine lay open on the small desk. A crew uniform hung in the open closet, still on its hanger. But everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the magazine's date was from 2007, 18 years ago. I moved deeper into the cabin, my footsteps echoing strangely in the small space. That's when I noticed the belongings scattered throughout the room didn't belong to just one person. 3 different name tags were pinned to the uniform in the closet. A man's watch and a woman's bracelet both sat on the bathroom counter. Personal photos were taped to the mirror, showing different crew members, different faces, all smiling in tropical ports I recognized from our current itinerary. I picked up one of the name tags with my gloved hand. Chen, it read. Cabin steward. I photographed it with my phone, then started documenting everything else. More name tags. More personal items. 7 crew members total, based on the identification I found. I pulled out my phone and started researching the names, pulling up crew databases I probably shouldn't have had access to. Every single person had the same notation in their file. Contract terminated voluntarily. Left ship at various ports between 2006 and 2019. No forwarding information. No references, just gone. That's when I heard the scratching. It started soft, coming from inside the walls beside the bed. Not the random scurrying of rats or the settling of the ship's metal infrastructure. This was deliberate, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging against metal in a pattern. 3 short scratches, 3 long, 3 short. Over and over again. SOS. The temperature dropped further. I could see ice crystals forming on the metal fixtures in the bathroom. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, now coming from multiple locations inside the walls. Above me, beside me, behind the closet, surrounding me on all sides. I grabbed my phone and started backing toward the door, still filming. That's when I saw movement in the closet. The uniform was swaying slightly, as if disturbed by a breeze. But there was no breeze. The cabin's ventilation had been shut off, probably years ago. The scratching suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, my rapid breathing visible in the frozen air. Then, from inside the walls, I heard something new. Voices. Multiple voices, overlapping, whispering in languages I couldn't identify. Growing louder, more urgent. My phone's screen went black despite showing full battery seconds before. The cabin lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. In the darkness, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Coming from somewhere deeper in the cabin, from a space that shouldn't exist in a room this small. I ran, slammed into the door frame in my panic, felt my shoulders scream in pain, but I didn't stop. I burst into the corridor and kept running, not bothering to close the door behind me. Behind me, I heard the whispers spilling out of 312, growing louder, chasing me down the corridor. I didn't stop running until I reached the main service area, surrounded by bright lights and normal sounds and the familiar smell of industrial cleaner. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold my phone. I checked the time. 12:58 a.m., 2 minutes before Carmen's deadline. I pulled up the photos I'd taken, but they were gone. Every single one deleted. Or rather, they'd never existed at all. My photo gallery showed no images from the past hour, but my phone's storage showed I'd used significant space. The photos were there, somewhere, just no longer accessible. When I reported back to Carmen, I lied. Told her the smell was from a backed-up drain, easily fixed. She looked at me for a long moment, taking in my pale face, my shaking hands, the way I couldn't quite meet her eyes. She knew I was lying, but she also knew I'd learned my lesson. "Good," she said quietly. "Now forget you ever went in there. Forget everything you saw. Those cabins don't exist, Maria. The people who went in them don't exist anymore either. And if you're smart, you'll make sure you stay in the category of people who do." But I couldn't forget. That night, lying in my bunk, I heard the scratching again. Soft, distant, coming from somewhere deep in the ship's infrastructure. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. 7 different rhythms, overlapping. 7 people who never left this ship, trapped in walls that officially didn't exist, in cabins that weren't supposed to be there. And I realized with creeping horror that Carmen hadn't sent me to that cabin because of a passenger complaint. She'd sent me because I'd been asking questions, because I'd been curious. She'd sent me there as a warning. The question was whether I'd be smart enough to heed it. I should have let it go. Carmen's warning was clear enough, and I'd seen things in that cabin that my rational mind couldn't explain. But those 7 names haunted me. Chen, Rodriguez, Patel, Okonkwo, Kim, Santos, Dalka. Real people with families somewhere, listed as voluntary departures when their belongings were still hanging in a frozen cabin that shouldn't exist. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that scratching. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. 7 different rhythms begging for help from inside the walls. After 5 days of running on caffeine and fear, I made a decision. If no one else would investigate what happened to those crew members, I would. The ship's administrative offices were on Deck 2, accessible only to senior staff during normal hours. But I'd learned that security was surprisingly lax between 2 and 4 a.m. when most crew were either working or sleeping. I waited until my roommates were all on shift, then slipped out wearing my uniform with my ID badge prominently displayed. Looking like you belonged somewhere was 90% of getting away with being there. The personnel office was locked, but I'd watched Carmen enter her code enough times to memorize it. The filing system was half digitized, half paper records, a bureaucratic nightmare that worked in my favor. I started with the digital database, searching for the names I'd found in cabin 312. Chen David, cabin steward, hired February 2006. Contract terminated voluntarily June 2006. Left ship in Cozumel. No disciplinary record. No explanation for early departure. I pulled up his hiring photo. Young guy, maybe 25, smiling at the camera with the nervous excitement of someone starting their first cruise contract. Just like I had looked 4 weeks ago. I searched the others. Same pattern. All hired. All left within their first 6 months. All departed at different ports, with no explanation. All marked as voluntary terminations. But when I cross-referenced their departure dates, something made my stomach clench. They hadn't left randomly. Each departure was exactly 6 months after the previous one. Like clockwork, the most recent was Santos, Maria. She'd left in January of this year, which meant we were now 4 months into the current 6-month cycle. I was searching for patterns in port cities, trying to understand why these specific crew members had been targeted when I found the paper files. They were stored in old-fashioned filing cabinets, the kind that predated the digital system. Records going back to 1989 when this ship first launched. I started pulling files, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every 6 months, for 35 years, sometimes cabin stewards, sometimes engineers, sometimes kitchen staff, always crew members in their first contract, always marked as voluntary departures. Over 70 people total. 70 crew members who had allegedly quit and walked off this ship, leaving their belongings, their final paychecks, their lives behind. My hands were shaking as I photographed everything with my phone. This wasn't just a cover-up. This was systematic, organized, something built into the ship's very operation. I was about to search for security footage when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. I barely had time to shove the files back and close the cabinets before the door opened. The hotel director stood there, a man named Richard Townsend, who I'd seen exactly twice since boarding. He was in his late 50s, perfectly groomed even at 3 a.m., and his expression showed no surprise at finding me there. "Miss Reyes," he said calmly, "I wondered when you would end up here. You're more persistent than most." The way he said most made my blood run cold. "I was just looking for my personnel file. I think there's an error in my pay stub." At 3 in the morning, how dedicated. He stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. The problem with curious crew members is they never understand what they're actually curious about. You think you've discovered some conspiracy, some dark secret we're hiding. 70 people have disappeared from this ship over 35 years. All from Deck 3, all marked as voluntary departures when their things are still in cabin 312. Townsend smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And you think you're going to expose this? Report it to authorities when we dock in St. Thomas?" He pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. It was my personnel file. Maria Reyes, age 23, no family, student loan debt of $47,000. Worked 3 waitressing jobs to make rent in Tampa before this contract. No one is looking for you, Maria. No one would notice if you became the 71st name on that list. I tried to push past him toward the door, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong. You're going to listen very carefully. This ship has operational requirements that supersede standard maritime law. Every 6 months, the ship requires a specific kind of maintenance. We've tried to stop it. We've tried to understand it. But some things are older than our understanding, built into vessels in ways that can't be removed or reasoned with. His voice was matter of fact, like he was explaining a scheduling conflict. The previous owners knew. We inherited both the ship and its requirements, and we've maintained perfect operational records by meeting those requirements exactly as specified. You're feeding people to something. To what? What's in those walls? The ship herself. He released my arm but blocked the door. When they salvaged the metal to build the Celestial Horizon, they used steel from 13 different vessels. 12 were perfectly normal. One was the SS Markarian, which sank in 1952 under circumstances that were never fully explained. 317 people died when she went down. Their bodies were never recovered, but their metal was. And somehow, their hunger was preserved in it. I thought of the voices I'd heard in cabin 312, the scratching from inside the walls, the impossible cold. That's insane. Yes, but it's also true. We've tried everything, Maria. Exorcists, maritime investigators. We even tried to decommission Deck 3 entirely, but the hunger just spread to other areas. So we made a choice. We feed it. We select crew members who won't be missed, who signed the right waivers without reading them, who fit the profile. And in exchange, the ship operates perfectly. No accidents, no outbreaks, no disasters. The Celestial Horizon has the best safety record in the industry. Because you sacrifice people to keep it that way. We maintain operational requirements. He pulled out a tablet and showed me security footage from the corridor outside cabin 312. The timestamp was from earlier tonight. This is you, 2 hours ago, entering restricted administrative areas without authorization, theft of confidential files, violation of your employment contract, grounds for immediate termination and prosecution. The footage was clearly doctored, but I had no way to prove it. You're framing me. I'm giving you a choice. You can leave this office, return to your duties, and forget everything you've learned. Finish your contract. Walk off this ship in 6 months with your pay and references intact. Or you can continue investigating, and you'll become the next name that disappears into Deck 3. He leaned closer, and I could smell coffee on his breath. The ship is already interested in you, Maria. You've spent too much time near those cabins. You've heard its voice. It started to recognize you. If I put you on the list now, it would barely even notice the transition. I wanted to run, to fight, to scream. But we were in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, surrounded by water in every direction, on a ship where the command structure had been covering up murders for 3 decades. Who would I report to? The captain who had been here for 12 years? The security chief who conveniently never had footage of the disappearances? What happens to them? The people who go into those walls? We don't know. The cabin is empty again by morning. The belongings remain, but the person is gone, incorporated into the ship somehow. Still conscious, we think, based on the sounds, still aware. still trapped. He opened the door. "You have until sunrise to decide, Miss Reyes. Accept that this is bigger than you and learn to live with it, or become part of the infrastructure yourself. Those are your only options." He left me standing in the office, surrounded by files documenting 70 people who had made the wrong choice. I looked at my phone, at the photos I'd taken of the records. But even as I watched, they began to delete themselves one by one. The ship's Wi-Fi system, controlled by people who knew exactly what I'd been doing. I walked back to my cabin on shaking legs. The sun was starting to rise, painting the ocean in shades of orange and red. In 6 hours, I'd start another shift, servicing cabins and smiling at passengers who had no idea they were sailing on a ship that ate people to maintain its perfect safety record. I had 2 months left before the 6-month cycle completed. 2 months to decide if I was going to stay quiet or become the 71st victim. But as I passed Deck 3 on my way to crew quarters, I heard it again. The scratching from inside the walls. Louder now, more insistent. And underneath it, a new sound. My name, whispered by voices that were no longer quite human, calling me home to a cabin that was waiting to add my belongings to its collection. The ship had recognized me, and now it was only a matter of time before it claimed me. I took the engineering position on the Pacific Empress because it paid twice what I was making at the power plant in Seattle. My maritime engineering certification had been gathering dust for 3 years, and when the recruiter called offering a 6-month contract with full benefits, I didn't hesitate. I was 29, single, and tired of watching my college friends buy houses while I struggled to pay off my student loans. 6 months at sea seemed like a small price for financial stability. The Pacific Empress was even larger than I'd imagined. One of those floating cities that carries 5,000 passengers and 2,000 crew. The engine room was my cathedral. A massive space spanning 4 levels below the waterline, filled with diesel generators, propulsion systems, and enough mechanical complexity to keep a team of 30 engineers busy around the clock. I reported to Chief Engineer Anderson, a Swedish man in his 50s, who had the tired eyes of someone who'd spent too many years maintaining machinery that never stopped running. My first week was orientation and safety training. The engine room operated on a strict hierarchy, and as the newest junior engineer, I was assigned to the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., when most of the crew was sleeping and the machinery ran with minimal supervision. I'd be working under Gary, an Australian guy in his late 30s who'd been on ships for 15 years. Gary was friendly enough during the day shift training, showing me the layout of the engine room, explaining the maintenance schedules, teaching me which sounds were normal and which ones meant something was about to catastrophically fail. It was during my 3rd day of training that Gary first mentioned the 3rd sub-level. We were standing on the main engine room floor, level 1, looking down through the metal grating at the levels below. I could see level 2 clearly, where the auxiliary generators hummed steadily. Below that was level 3, but the lighting was different down there. Dimmer. The shadows seemed thicker somehow. "You'll handle most of your work on levels 1 and 2, Gary said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Level 3 is technically your responsibility for overnight monitoring, but try to avoid going down there unless absolutely necessary." "Why? What's on level 3? "Same equipment as everywhere else. Generators, cooling systems, fuel lines. Nothing special." He paused, then added, "Except it doesn't behave quite right. Temperature gauges go haywire. Equipment runs when it shouldn't, stops when it should be running. We've had technicians from the manufacturer out here 6 times trying to diagnose the problems, and they can't find anything wrong with the machinery." "Electrical issues? Bad sensors?" That's what we thought. We replaced every sensor on that level 2 years ago. Didn't change anything. Gary finally looked at me directly. The real issue is the guys who work down there alone report weird stuff. Voices when no one else is around. Tools going missing and showing up in impossible places. Shadows moving independently of light sources. Corporate thinks it's just exhaustion and isolation playing tricks. But every engineer who spent significant time on level 3 has either requested a transfer or quit entirely. You're telling me the engine room is haunted? I tried to keep my tone light, but Gary's expression remained serious. I'm telling you that something about level 3 isn't right. Maybe it's just the layout playing tricks with sound and light. Maybe it's carbon monoxide from a leak we haven't found. Maybe it's something else. But the overnight shift has rules. Never go to level 3 alone. If you absolutely must go down there, take a radio and keep someone on the line the entire time. And if you hear voices or see anyone down there who's not on the duty roster, you get back to level 1 immediately and report it. Has anyone actually been hurt down there? Gary was quiet for a long moment. We had an engineer named Marcus 2 years ago. Good guy, experienced, not the type to spook easily. He was doing a routine check on level 3 around 2 a.m. when he radioed that he needed help with a valve that was stuck. His partner went down to assist, found Marcus unconscious on the floor with no obvious injuries. Medical bay couldn't explain it. No head trauma, no cardiac event, nothing. He just collapsed. When he woke up 6 hours later, he couldn't remember going to level 3 at all. Couldn't remember the past 3 weeks, actually. Complete memory loss. Did he finish his contract? He refused to go back to the engine room. Requested a transfer to deck maintenance. Lasted another month before leaving the ship in Singapore and never coming back. Gary checked his watch. Look, 99% of the time, everything runs fine. You'll probably work your entire contract without any issues. Just follow the rules, trust your instincts, and don't take unnecessary risks. The machinery doesn't care if you're brave or curious. It'll kill you just the same if you make stupid choices. That night, my first solo overnight shift, I stood on level 1 and looked down at level 3 through the metal grating. The machinery was running smoothly. The ambient noise was exactly what it should be. Everything appeared normal. But Gary's warning echoed in my mind. Something about the shadows down there seemed wrong, like they were deeper than they should be, like they existed independently of the lights that should have been casting them. I told myself it was just my imagination. First night jitters combined with Gary's creepy stories. But as I watched, one of the shadows moved. Not the way shadows shift when lights flicker or someone walks past. This shadow detached itself from the machinery and walked across the floor on level 3, passing directly under a bright overhead light without disappearing. I grabbed my radio, ready to call Gary. But the shadow stopped, turned, and looked up directly at me. I couldn't see features. Couldn't see anything that should have cast a human-shaped shadow. But I could feel its attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then it stepped back into the machinery and vanished, leaving me alone on level 1, wondering what I'd actually seen and whether I should report it. The machinery continued running perfectly. The temperature gauges read normal, nothing was technically wrong, which meant I had no legitimate reason to sound an alarm. So I made a note in the log, marked the timestamp, and spent the rest of my shift convincing myself that exhaustion and suggestion had played tricks on my perception. But I didn't go down to level 3 that night. And when my shift ended at 7 a.m. and Gary arrived to relieve me, the first thing he asked was whether I'd seen anything unusual. The knowing look in his eyes told me he already knew the answer. 2 weeks passed before I had no choice but to go down to level 3. A cooling pump alarm triggered at 1:15 a.m., and protocol required visual inspection within 30 minutes. Gary was on his break, and I couldn't justify waking the chief engineer for what was probably a faulty sensor. I grabbed my toolkit, flashlight, and radio, then descended the metal stairs. The temperature hit me immediately. Level 3 should have been hot, all engine rooms run warm, but this was wrong. The air near the stairs was cold enough to see my breath, while heat shimmered off the machinery 20 feet away. The temperature wasn't just fluctuating, it was existing in 2 states simultaneously. I followed the pump numbers stenciled on the floor, trying to ignore the way sounds echoed strangely down here. My footsteps seemed to repeat a half second after I made them, like the space itself was mimicking my movements. The cooling pump looked fine, no leaks or unusual vibrations, but the temperature gauge was reading both 32 degrees and 114 degrees at the same time. I tapped it, assuming a malfunction, and that's when I heard the voices. They came from deeper in the machinery, behind the main generator housing where maintenance access was limited. The language was nothing I recognized, guttural and rhythmic, with sounds that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. Multiple speakers, maybe 3 or 4, conversing in whispered urgency. I keyed my radio. "Gary, you there?" Static, then his voice. "Yeah, mate. Find the problem?" "I'm hearing voices. Behind generator 3. You got anyone else down here?" Long pause. "Negative. You're solo on level 3. Get back to level 1 now." But I was already moving toward the voices, my flashlight cutting through the shadows between machinery. I should have listened to Gary. I should have followed protocol. But something about those voices pulled at me, made me need to understand what I was hearing. Behind the generator was a maintenance crawlspace I hadn't noticed during training. The voices were coming from inside. I squeezed through the narrow opening and found myself in a space that shouldn't exist according to the ship's blueprints. Someone had carved out a cavity in the infrastructure, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, hidden completely from normal engine room operations. It was a living space, crude but functional. Bedding made from stolen linens arranged in the corner. Empty food containers, the kind used in the crew mess, stacked against one wall. A bucket in the corner serving as a toilet, still reeking. And scattered throughout, personal items, photographs, crew ID badges, articles of clothing. Evidence that multiple people had been using this space. The voices stopped the moment my flashlight beam swept the area. The temperature plummeted instantly, cold enough that frost began forming on the metal surfaces. My breath came out in thick clouds as I moved my light across the space, seeing more details that made my stomach clench. Scratch marks on the walls, symbols carved into the metal that looked ancient and deliberate, and written in something dark that might have been oil or might have been blood. Words in English. "They don't let us leave." My radio crackled. "James, status. Report now." I found something. A hidden room behind generator 3. Someone's been living here. Multiple someones. "Get out. Right now. That's an order." But I was frozen, staring at a photograph pinned to the wall. It showed a crew member, young guy, smiling in his engineering uniform. The name tag read, Marcus. The same Marcus who'd collapsed down here 2 years ago with no memory of what happened. Behind me, the voices started again. Closer now. No longer whispered, but spoken at normal volume. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness, and saw them. They were human, or they had been. 3 figures wearing tattered crew uniforms, their skin gray and waxy, their eyes reflecting my flashlight like animals. They stood between me and the crawlspace exit, blocking my escape. Their mouths moved in sync with the impossible voices, speaking words that predated modern language. I scrambled backward, deeper into the hidden space, and my hand found something wet. Fresh food. A half-eaten sandwich that couldn't have been here more than a few hours, which meant they'd been up in the crew areas recently. They'd been walking among us. "James!" Gary's voice on the radio sounded desperate. "I'm coming down. Hold position." But the figures were advancing, moving with jerky coordination, like puppets controlled by the same strings. I could see now that their crew uniforms were from different eras, different cruise lines. One wore a style that hadn't been used since the 1990s. They weren't crew members who'd been hiding. They were something that had taken crew members, worn them like masks, and been living in the infrastructure for decades. The temperature dropped so low, my flashlight began to dim, frost forming on the lens. I tried to push past them toward the exit, but they grabbed me with hands that were too cold and too strong. Their mouths opened wider than they should, and the voices poured out, no longer ancient language, but words I understood. Stay. Work. Feed the ship. Like we do. Like Marcus does. Marcus left. He transferred off this ship. The figures laughed, a sound like metal scraping metal. One of them turned its head at an impossible angle and pointed deeper into the hidden space. A flashlight beam followed, illuminating another area I hadn't seen. More bedding, more stolen supplies. And sitting against the far wall, still wearing his engineering uniform, was Marcus. His eyes were open but vacant, his skin the same gray waxy texture as the others. He'd never left the ship. He'd never left Level 3. They were still holding me when Gary burst through the crawl space, flashlight in one hand, wrench in the other. The figures released me instantly and melted back into the shadows, their voices fading to whispers. Gary grabbed my arm and dragged me back through the crawl space, not speaking until we were on Level 1. "They let you go," he said, breathing hard. "They never let anyone go." I looked down at Level 3, where shadows moved independently of light, where crew members who disappeared years ago still worked maintenance shifts for something that lived in the machinery. And I realized I'd been marked. Whatever was down there, it recognized me now, and eventually it would call me back. I reported everything to Chief Engineer Anderson the next morning. The hidden space, the figures, Marcus still down there after 2 years. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he made a single phone call to ship security. 4 officers descended to Level 3 with me and Gary. We squeezed through the crawl space behind Generator 3, and I braced myself to see those gray figures again, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But the space was empty. Completely empty. The bedding was gone. The food containers had vanished. Even the scratch marks and symbols I'd seen carved into the metal had disappeared, the walls now smooth and unmarked. "There's nothing here," the lead security officer said, shining his flashlight around the bare space. "Just an old maintenance access that was sealed off years ago." It wasn't sealed. They were living here, 3 of them, and Marcus. My voice sounded desperate even to my own ears. Gary touched my shoulder. "Mate, we all see things down here on night shift. The isolation, the noise, it plays tricks. But I saw something the security officers missed. In the corner where Marcus had been sitting, barely visible in the dim light, was a crew ID badge. I picked it up while they were examining the empty space. Marcus Chen, Junior Engineer. The plastic was cold, so cold it burned my fingers. I pocketed it without showing them. When we returned to Level 1, the security chief filed his report. No evidence of unauthorized personnel, no signs of habitation. possible hallucination brought on by carbon monoxide exposure. They installed a new CO detector on level 3 and marked my file with a mandatory psychological evaluation before my next shift. That night, I tried to sleep but couldn't. At 2:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Just coordinates and a time. Engine room, level 3, generator 30300. I knew I shouldn't go. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to delete the message and stay in my cabin. But I thought about Marcus, about the vacant look in his eyes, about the way those figures had spoken through him. Someone needed to know the truth. The engine room was deserted when I arrived, just the constant hum of machinery. I descended to level 3, the temperature already shifting wrong. Behind generator 3, the crawl space was open again, and standing in front of it was Marcus. Real Marcus, not the gray puppet I'd seen before. He looked exactly like his crew photo, young and vital, except his eyes held an ancient exhaustion. "They let me out to warn you," he said, "to tell you the truth before you end up like me." What are they? Stowaways, not human. They've been on this ship since it launched, hiding in spaces that don't officially exist. They feed on crew members who come down here alone, not all at once, slowly, taking pieces of us until there's nothing left but shells that look human enough to avoid suspicion. He lifted his shirt. Where his abdomen should have been was a hollow cavity, edges rough like torn paper. I could see through him to the machinery behind. Security found nothing because they only exist when they're hunting. The rest of the time, they're part of the ship itself, woven into the metal. Marcus's voice cracked. "I've been trying to warn people for 2 years, but I can only manifest for a few minutes at a time. They're getting stronger. They used to only take 1 crew member per voyage. Now they're taking more. You felt it, didn't you? When they touched you, they left a mark." I looked at my arm where they'd grabbed me. The skin was pale, cold to the touch, and when I pressed it, my fingers sank in slightly, like my flesh had become less solid. How do I stop it? You don't. You either leave the ship at the next port and never come back, or you end up like me. A ghost, stuck warning the next victim while the things that used to be your co-workers walk around wearing your face. Behind him, the 3 figures emerged from the crawl space. But now I could see there were more. Dozens of them, stretching back into darkness that seemed infinite. Every crew member who'd ever disappeared from this ship, hollowed out and controlled, still working their shifts in a level of reality passengers and most crew would never perceive. Marcus began to fade. "They're calling me back. Run, James. Get off this ship before you become permanent crew like the rest of us." The figures surged forward. I ran for the stairs, feeling their cold hands brush against me, feeling more of my substance drain away with each touch. I made it to level 1 and kept running, up through crew quarters, out onto the deck, into the pre-dawn darkness where the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions. I looked down at my hands. They were translucent in the deck lights, and I could see the outline of the railing through my palms. The infection was spreading faster than Marcus had warned. By the time we reached port in 3 days, I might not be solid enough to walk down the gangway. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The rhythm exactly matching the machinery below. I turned and saw Gary walking toward me, but his eyes were vacant. His skin had that gray, waxy texture, and when he opened his mouth to speak, the ancient voices poured out. "We need engineers, James. The ship always needs engineers. And you're already part of the crew now. You've been part of the crew since the moment you came down to level 3, You just didn't know it yet. I looked at my reflection in the window. My crew uniform was fading, becoming translucent like my hands. And behind my own reflection, I could see them. Dozens of gray figures standing on the deck, all wearing engineering uniforms from different decades, all with the same vacant eyes. I'd become permanent crew, and my first shift was about to begin in the machinery that would consume what was left of my soul. I noticed the pattern during my second week as guest services coordinator on the Mediterranean Star. I was reviewing long-term passenger accounts, the handful of people who book extended voyages and essentially live on the ship for months at a time, when I came across Suite 512. The booking had been active for 3 years and 42 days without interruption. No disembarkation at ports, no shore excursions, no charges to the account except for a single room service order placed every morning at exactly 3:17 a.m. The guest was listed as Eleanor Vance, age 78, with an address in Connecticut that had been demolished according to a quick internet search. Her account was paid in full for the next 2 years, a sum exceeding $400,000, wired from a bank that had been closed since 2006. Every red flag in guest services protocol was present, yet somehow her account remained active and in good standing. I asked my supervisor, Patricia, about it during our afternoon briefing. She was a woman in her early 50s who'd worked cruise ships for 20 years, and her reaction to my question was immediate and uncomfortable. She physically flinched when I mentioned Suite 512. "That account is handled exclusively by corporate," she said, not meeting my eyes. "It's been flagged as VIP status. We don't disturb the guest. We don't question the billing. We simply fulfill the room service requests exactly as specified." But 3 years without leaving the suite. Shouldn't medical check on her? What if she's incapacitated or being held against her will? Patricia closed the door to her office and lowered her voice. "Sarah, I'm going to give you advice that will make your time on this ship much easier. There are certain passengers, certain suites, certain situations that are above our pay grade. Suite 512 is one of them. The room service order gets delivered every morning at 3:17 a.m. The tray is left outside the door. Exactly 1 hour later, housekeeping collects the empty tray. That's the extent of our involvement. Has anyone actually seen her? Spoken to her? Not in the 3 years I've been here. But the trays come back empty. The suite occupancy sensors show movement. The account remains active. That's all we need to know." Patricia opened her office door, signaling the conversation was over. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, Sarah. They're meant to be accommodated. But I couldn't let it go. That night, I pulled the full guest history for Eleanor Vance. The booking had originated in January of 2022, a standard 7-night Mediterranean cruise. But instead of disembarking at the end of the voyage, the account simply continued. Week after week, month after month, with automatic renewals and advance payments appearing in the system from sources that no longer existed. The room service orders were identical every single day. 1 pot of Earl Grey tea, 1 slice of unbuttered wheat toast, 1 soft-boiled egg, delivered at 3:17 a.m. without variation for over 3 years. But what disturbed me most was the guest services notes attached to the account. Brief entries from previous coordinators, each one asking the same questions I had, each one ending with a variation of, "Advised by management to leave account as is." The most recent note was from 6 months ago, written by my predecessor, a woman named Jennifer, who'd left the ship abruptly, according to Patricia. The note read, "Attempted wellness check Suite 512. Door opened 4 inches, chain engaged. Glimpsed figure inside. Recommend no further contact. Requesting immediate transfer. Jennifer's request had been denied. She'd left the ship 2 days later at Civitavecchia, citing a family emergency that Patricia admitted seemed fabricated. Her personnel file showed she'd been an excellent employee with no previous issues. Something about Suite 512 had frightened her badly enough to abandon a well-paying position with no notice. I decided I needed to see this mysterious passenger for myself. The room service delivery happened at 3:17 a.m., which meant the overnight staff handled it. I volunteered to cover the graveyard shift for our regular coordinator who wanted time off, and Patricia approved it without asking why. Maybe she knew. Maybe she was curious to see if I'd have the same reaction as Jennifer. My first night on the graveyard shift, I watched as the galley prepared Eleanor Vance's order at 3 a.m. sharp. Same items, same presentation, placed on a silver tray with a cloth napkin. The room service attendant, a Filipino man named Carlos, who'd worked the ship for 8 years, carried it up to Deck 5 without a word. I followed at a distance, staying out of sight as Carlos approached Suite 512. He knocked twice, announced room service, and set the tray down outside the door. Then he walked away quickly, almost running, without waiting to see if the door would open. I understood why when I heard the sound. The door opened slowly, the chain lock rattling, and a hand reached out to retrieve the tray. The hand was wrong. Too pale, skin like parchment, fingers that bent at angles that weren't quite natural. It grabbed the tray and pulled it inside with a speed that contradicted the elderly woman, supposedly occupying the suite. The door closed with a soft click, and I heard the chain lock slide back into place. I stood in the corridor for several minutes, heart pounding, staring at that door. Suite 512. A room that had been continuously occupied for 3 years by someone who ordered the same breakfast every morning at 3:17 a.m. Someone whose hand looked like it belonged to a corpse. Someone whose account was paid from banks that no longer existed, by money that shouldn't still be transferable. Patricia had been right about one thing. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. But I knew, standing in that quiet corridor at 3:20 a.m., that I was going to solve this one anyway. Even if it meant ending up like Jennifer, running from the ship and never looking back. Because that hand I'd seen reaching for the tray hadn't belonged to a 78-year-old woman named Eleanor Vance. It had belonged to something that was wearing her identity like a costume, living in that suite, ordering room service every morning, and waiting for someone like me to get curious enough to investigate. The emergency maintenance call came 2 weeks after I started working graveyard shifts. A water leak in Suite 510 was spreading to the adjacent suite, 512. Protocol required immediate access to prevent structural damage, and for the first time in 3 years, someone would need to enter Eleanor Vance's room, whether she permitted it or not. Patricia assigned me to accompany the maintenance crew, perhaps as punishment for my continued interest in the mysterious guest. She handed me the master key card with the expression that was equal parts warning and resignation. Whatever you see in there, you document it and report directly to me. No one else. Understood? The maintenance supervisor was a Greek man named Dimitri, who'd worked the ship for 12 years. When I told him we were accessing Suite 512, his face went pale. That room? I was here when they sealed it. That was 8 years ago, after the last coordinator tried to enter. Sealed it. But the guest is still active. Someone's been accepting room service deliveries. Dimitri shook his head slowly. The door opens 4 inches, enough for the tray. No one has been fully inside that suite since 2016. The previous hotel director ordered it sealed after what happened to the coordinator who tried to do a wellness check. What happened to her? She went inside. She was only in there for maybe 3 minutes before she started screaming. Security had to drag her out. She couldn't speak for 2 days, and when she finally could, all she would say was that the room was wrong. That time was wrong inside. Corporate paid her a settlement and she signed an NDA. But I was there when they pulled her out, and her hair had turned completely white. She was 35 years old. We reached Suite 512 at 4 a.m., an hour after the room service. Tray had been retrieved. I knocked, announced our presence, explained the emergency maintenance requirement. No response. I used the master key card and pushed the door open. The chain lock was engaged, but Dimitri had bolt cutters. The chain snapped with a metallic crack that echoed in the hallway. I pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. The temperature hit me first. The suite was freezing, cold enough to see our breath despite the ship's climate control running constantly. But the cold wasn't the shocking part. The suite was perfectly preserved from a different era. Not 2022 when Eleanor Vance supposedly boarded, but sometime in the late 1970s. The furniture was vintage, upholstered in burnt orange and avocado green. A rotary telephone sat on the nightstand. The television was an old CRT model with rabbit ear antennas. Magazines on the coffee table were dated 1978. And everywhere, personal belongings. Women's clothing hanging in the closet, vintage styles from 47 years ago. Perfume bottles on the vanity, brands that hadn't been manufactured in decades. A purse containing a wallet with identification. I picked up the ID with trembling hands. Eleanor Vance, aged 78, Connecticut address. But the license had been issued in 1976. This wasn't the Eleanor Vance whose account was currently active. This was the original Eleanor Vance, and according to the ship's historical records I'd researched, she had died on this vessel in 1978 of a heart attack in her sleep. "This is impossible," Dimitri whispered behind me. The ship was completely renovated in 2005. All the suites were gutted and rebuilt. This furniture, this layout, none of it should exist anymore. But it did exist. The suite had somehow been preserved exactly as it was the night Eleanor Vance died, trapped in a pocket of time that refused to move forward. And on the desk, I found something that made my blood run cold. Room service receipts. Dozens of them, dated from the past 3 years, all signed in shaky handwriting. Eleanor Vance. The receipts were stacked in chronological order, one for every single day. 3:17 a.m. Earl Grey tea, wheat toast, soft-boiled egg. But when I looked around the suite, I saw no evidence that any food had been consumed. The room service trays from the past week sat on a cart near the door. Untouched, the food rotted and covered in mold. "She's still ordering," I said quietly. "But she's not eating. The trays come back empty, but the food never gets consumed." Dimitri was backing toward the door. "We need to leave. Now." But I was staring at the bed, where the covers were pulled back as if someone had just risen. The impression of a body was visible on the sheets, and steam rose from a cup of tea on the nightstand. Fresh steam from tea that had just been poured. I picked up the cup with shaking hands. It was hot. Behind me, I heard the bathroom door creak open. I turned slowly, knowing what I would see but hoping I was wrong. Standing in the bathroom doorway, wearing a nightgown from 1978, was Eleanor Vance, or what remained of her. Her skin was translucent, her eyes clouded with cataracts, and she moved with the jerky motion of someone whose body had forgotten how to function properly. She smiled at me, revealing teeth that were yellowed and cracked. When she spoke, her voice sounded like wind through a tunnel. "I've been expecting you, dear. I saw you watching my door. Would you like some tea? I always order extra, hoping someone will join me. It gets so lonely traveling alone." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Eleanor shuffled closer, and I could see now that she was partially transparent. I could see the bathroom tiles through her body. She'd been dead for 47 years, but somehow her consciousness remained, trapped in this suite, repeating the same routine, ordering the same breakfast, waiting for someone to acknowledge her existence. "I died here," she said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Heart attack in my sleep, but I never left. The ship wouldn't let me leave, and now I'm part of it, just like all the others. Would you like to stay? It's quite comfortable once you accept that you're not going anywhere." She reached out to touch my face with fingers that passed through my skin like ice water. I felt something cold grip my chest, felt my heart skip a beat, felt the same sensation Eleanor must have experienced the night she died. Behind me, Dimitri was screaming for me to move, but I was frozen, staring into the dead woman's eyes as she smiled and poured another cup of tea. "Don't worry, dear. The first death is always the hardest, but you'll get used to it. We all do, eventually." Dimitri dragged me out of Suite 512 before Eleanor's ghostly fingers could close around my throat. The cold sensation in my chest faded as we stumbled into the hallway, both of us gasping for air. The maintenance supervisor slammed the doors shut and we stood there, trembling, staring at the innocuous-looking suite entrance that concealed something that should not exist. "You saw her too?" I managed to whisper. "I saw her. That's the third time I've seen her in 12 years. Each time someone opens that door fully, she becomes more solid, more real." Dimitri was already walking away, leaving his tools scattered in the corridor. "I'm filing this as impossible to access. Let corporate deal with it. I'm not going back in there." I should have followed his example. Should have written my report, flagged the account, and forgotten about Eleanor Vance and her frozen suite from 1978. But that night, unable to sleep, I started researching the ship's history more thoroughly. What I found in the archived incident reports made everything worse. Eleanor Vance hadn't been the ship's only death in 1978. 3 other passengers had died that same cruise, all from cardiac events, all in their sleep, all in suites on Deck 5. The ship had been investigated by maritime authorities, but no cause was ever determined. The deaths were ruled natural, tragic coincidences. The ship continued operating under different ownership, was renovated multiple times, but Deck 5 remained the deck with the highest mortality rate in the vessel's history. And Eleanor Vance had been special. She'd been traveling alone on what her booking notes described as a final voyage to scatter husband's ashes in Mediterranean. But I found the real story buried in old newspaper archives. Eleanor's husband hadn't died of natural causes. He'd killed himself 6 months before her cruise, despondent over their daughter's death in a car accident. Eleanor had boarded the ship alone, grieving both losses, and had died in her sleep 3 days into the voyage. But here's what made my hands shake as I read. Eleanor's son and his family, her only surviving relatives, had died in a car accident on the same day Eleanor died aboard the ship. 4 people killed instantly when their vehicle was struck by a truck on a Connecticut highway. Which meant Eleanor had died not knowing her entire family was already gone. She'd died still believing she had people to return home to, still believing someone was waiting for her. The next night, working my graveyard shift, I heard the first report. A passenger in Suite 320 called the front desk at 2:40 a.m., complaining about an elderly woman knocking on his door. He described her as wearing a formal gown from several decades ago, asking to borrow his phone because she needed to call her son about an emergency. When he'd refused and closed the door, the knocking had continued for over an hour. Security reviewed the hallway footage. Nothing. No one had been in that corridor except the complaining passenger. But 3 other passengers on Deck 3 called with identical complaints over the next hour. An old woman in vintage formal wear, knocking persistently, asking to borrow a phone, saying her family needed to know where she was. I pulled Eleanor Vance's original booking information and found photographs attached to her guest profile. In the photo, she was wearing the exact formal gown the passengers had described. A dark blue evening dress with pearl buttons, the style from the late 1970s. The reports continued every night. Eleanor was leaving her suite, walking the corridors of the ship, searching for a phone to call family members who'd been dead for 47 years. She moved between decks, appearing in different locations, always at night, always asking the same question, always wearing the same formal gown she'd worn to the captain's dinner the night before she died. I started tracking the sightings on a ship map. Over a week, I documented 43 separate encounters. Eleanor wasn't staying on Deck 5 anymore. She was expanding her territory, moving through the entire ship, and with each sighting, she became more solid, more persistent, more aware that something was wrong. Then came the night a crew member, a young housekeeper named Maria, actually tried to help Eleanor. She'd encountered the ghost near the crew stairs at 3 a.m. and, not knowing the stories, had offered to let Eleanor use her cell phone. Maria told me later that Eleanor had taken the phone with hands that felt like ice, had dialed a number with trembling fingers, and had waited as it rang and rang with no answer. "Please," Eleanor had whispered, tears streaming down her translucent face. "Please, someone answer. I need to tell them I'm ready to come home now. I've been traveling so long, I just want to come home." But no one answered. The number had been disconnected for 47 years, and something in Eleanor had broken when she realized the truth. Maria said the ghost's face had contorted with anguish, and she'd screamed, a sound so full of grief and rage that it had set off motion sensors throughout 3 decks. Then Eleanor had vanished, and Maria had been left standing alone in the corridor, holding a phone that had frost coating its screen. After that night, the sightings changed. Eleanor was no longer politely asking to borrow phones. She was desperate, aggressive. She'd appear in suites while passengers slept, standing over their beds, shaking them awake, demanding they help her contact her family. Security responded to dozens of hysterical calls. Passengers demanding room changes, demanding refunds, some demanding to be helicoptered off the ship at the next port. Corporate sent a crisis management team. They tried everything. A priest performed a blessing on Deck 5. A medium was secretly brought aboard and attempted to communicate with Eleanor. Nothing worked. Eleanor had been trapped on this ship for 47 years, ordering the same breakfast, waiting in her frozen suite. And now that she understood her family was gone, she'd become something darker than a confused ghost. I found the final piece of the puzzle in Eleanor's original booking file. A note from the travel agent who'd arranged her cruise. Eleanor had specifically requested Suite 512 because that had been her and her husband's favorite suite on their anniversary cruise 10 years earlier. She'd wanted to feel close to him one last time. She'd scattered his ashes at sea 3 days into the voyage, then had returned to her suite and died peacefully in her sleep, believing she'd join him and eventually reunite with her family. But she hadn't moved on. Something about the ship, about that suite, about the violent concentration of deaths in 1978, had trapped her consciousness. And now, understanding that she had no family left to contact, no home to return to, Eleanor had stopped trying to leave. Instead, she was claiming the ship as her home, marking her territory deck by deck, and making it clear that if she couldn't leave, she'd make sure everyone else understood what it felt like to be trapped. The night I discovered all this, I was working late in the guest services office when I heard knocking on the door. Soft at first, then more insistent. I checked the security camera. No one was there. But the knocking continued, and then I heard her voice, thin and desperate, and filled with decades of accumulated grief. Please, I know you've been looking into my account. I know you understand. Help me call my son. He must be so worried. I've been gone for so long and I can't find my way home. Please, just help me make one phone call. I opened the door because I couldn't bear to listen to her grief anymore. Eleanor Vance stood in the corridor, wearing her formal gown, her face streaked with tears that left frost trails down her translucent cheeks. She looked solid now, more real than she'd been in Suite 512. She'd been feeding on the fear and attention, growing stronger with each sighting, each report, each passenger who acknowledged her existence. I know about your family, I told her gently. I know they're gone. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. But they died the same day you did. There's no one left to call. Her face changed. The grief transformed into something else. Rage, betrayal. The realization that she'd been trapped here alone, waiting for people who would never come for 47 years. The lights in the corridor began to flicker. The temperature plummeted, and Eleanor smiled. But it wasn't a human smile anymore. Then I don't need to wait any longer, do I? Her voice echoed from everywhere at once. If there's no one coming for me, then this ship is my home now. All of it. Every deck, every suite, every corridor. And everyone who stays here, everyone who tries to leave, they'll understand what it feels like to be forgotten. To die alone. To wait forever for someone who's never coming. She reached for me with hands that were now solid enough to grab, cold enough to freeze. I stumbled backward into the office and slammed the door. But I could hear her outside, knocking, knocking, knocking. The same rhythm she'd used on 43 doors over the past week. The same desperate plea now transformed into a promise. She would never stop knocking. She would never stop searching. And eventually, she would find a way to make sure no one ever left the Mediterranean Star. Because if Eleanor Vance couldn't go home, then no one could. We would all stay here with her, trapped in our own frozen moments, waiting for calls that would never come, and families that would never arrive. The knocking continues every night at 3:17 a.m. And each night, it gets a little louder. I'd been working food service on the Caribbean Dream for 6 weeks when I first noticed them. The crew mess hall was my domain from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., serving the night shift workers who kept the ship running while passengers slept. Mostly I saw engineers, security staff, housekeepers finishing their shifts. Familiar faces who'd grab coffee and a sandwich, chat for a few minutes, then head to their cabins. But after 2 a.m., when the mess hall was nearly empty, they started appearing. Crew members I'd never seen before, wearing uniforms that seemed slightly wrong. The colors were right, the Caribbean Dream logo was in the correct place, but something about the fit, the style, the fabric itself looked outdated. They'd enter through the main door in groups of 3 or 4, walk to the darkest corner of the mess hall where the overhead lights had been burned out for weeks, and sit in complete silence. They never ordered food, never spoke to me or each other. They just sat there, staring at anyone else who entered the mess hall with expressions that made my skin crawl. Hollow eyes, faces that seemed too pale under the fluorescent lighting. And they moved wrong, like their joints didn't quite bend the way human joints should. The first time I saw them, I assumed they were new crew from a recent port stop. We picked up additional staff regularly, and I couldn't be expected to know everyone on a ship carrying 2,000 crew members. But when I asked Carlos, my supervisor who'd worked the ship for 5 years, he gave me a strange look. The corner table after 2 a.m.? He set down the inventory clipboard and lowered his voice. Miguel, I'm going to give you the same advice I give everyone who works this shift. Don't look at them directly. Don't try to serve them. Don't acknowledge they're there at all. Just do your job and pretend that corner is empty. Who are they? Carlos glanced at the corner, even though we were having this conversation at noon when the mess hall was full of normal crew eating lunch. I don't know. No one does. They've been appearing on night shift for as long as I've been here. Management knows about them. Security knows about them. But there's no official explanation, and anyone who pushes too hard for answers ends up transferred off the ship. That's insane. You're telling me there are crew members who show up every night, don't eat, don't talk, and everyone just ignores them? I'm telling you that's how you survive working this shift. The people who tried to investigate, who tried to talk to them or figure out who they were, they had problems. Equipment failures, accidents. One guy, kitchen worker named Hassan, he tried to serve them coffee one night, walked right up to their table like they were normal customers. He was found unconscious in the walk-in freezer 3 hours later. Hypothermia, even though the freezer door wasn't locked and he could have walked out any time. Medical said it was like his body had forgotten how to regulate temperature. That should have been enough to make me follow orders. Keep my head down, ignore the silent crew members in the corner, collect my paycheck. But I've never been good at leaving mysteries alone. My mother always said my curiosity would get me in trouble someday. She was right. I started watching them carefully, pretending to wipe down tables or restock supplies while observing their behavior. They arrived at different times, always after 2 a.m., always in small groups. They'd sit for exactly 1 hour, never moving except to turn their heads in unison whenever someone entered the mess hall. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., they'd stand up simultaneously and leave through the same door they'd entered. I tried to follow them one night, hanging back as they filed out of the mess hall. They walked in perfect formation down the crew corridor, their footsteps making no sound on the metal floor. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding, as they descended a stairwell toward the lower decks. But when I reached the stairwell entrance, they'd vanished. The stairs were empty, and I could see all the way down to deck 2. There was nowhere they could have gone without me seeing them. The next night, I decided to try something different. I set up my phone to record video, hiding it behind a stack of coffee cups with a clear view of the corner table. If I couldn't figure out who they were by following them, maybe I could capture evidence of their strange behavior and force management to give me real answers. The footage I reviewed the next morning made no sense. The video showed the mess hall exactly as I remembered it. Me working behind the counter, 2 engineers getting coffee around 1:30 a.m., the mess hall empty at 2:15. But the corner table remained empty throughout the entire recording, even during the hour when I clearly remembered 5 of the silent crew members sitting there, staring at me with their hollow expressions. The video showed nothing but empty chairs. Either my phone had malfunctioned at the exact time they appeared, or they didn't register on electronic recording devices. Both options were impossible. Both options terrified me. That night, working my shift, I broke Carlos's rule. When they appeared at 2:13 a.m., I walked directly to their table with a pot of coffee and 5 cups. I was going to force an interaction, make them speak, prove they were real crew members with real explanations. They watched me approach with those hollow eyes. 5 of them tonight, 3 men and 2 women, all wearing slightly outdated uniforms. As I got closer, I realized I could see the wall behind them through their bodies. They were translucent, not quite solid, and the temperature around their table was at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the mess hall. I set the coffee pot down on their table with shaking hands. "Welcome to the crew mess. Can I get you anything?" They stared at me in silence. Then, moving in perfect synchronization, they all turned their heads to look at the wall clock. It was 2:17 a.m. They turned back to me, and one of them, a man with a name tag that read Morrison, opened his mouth. What came out wasn't a voice, but a sound like wind through a tunnel, forming words that seemed to come from somewhere far away. "You shouldn't have acknowledged us. Now you're part of the pattern. Now you'll understand why we can't leave." The lights in the mess hall flickered and died. When they came back on 3 seconds later, the corner table was empty, but the coffee pot I'd set down was still there, covered in a thick layer of frost. And on the table, written in condensation, were 5 names and a date. Morrison, Chen, Okafor, Schmidt, Reyes, March 15th, 2009. I looked up the date in the ship's records. March 15th, 2009. The Caribbean Dream had experienced a galley fire that killed 5 crew members. All night shift food service workers, all found in the crew mess hall, overcome by smoke while the rest of the ship evacuated safely. Their bodies had been recovered and sent home to their families for burial. But apparently, some part of them had never left. And now they knew I could see them. Now they knew I'd acknowledged their existence. And according to Morrison's impossible voice, that meant I was part of their pattern now. Whatever that meant, I was about to find out. I couldn't stop researching after that night. The names written in condensation haunted me. Morrison, Chen, Okafor, Schmidt, Reyes. I accessed the ship's historical archives during my breaks, cross-referencing crew rosters from 2009. Every name matched. David Morrison, night shift supervisor. Lisa Chen, prep cook. Emmanuel Okafor, dishwasher. Klaus Schmidt, line cook. And Maria Reyes, who shared my last name, just 18 years old on her first contract. The fire had started in the galley at 2:17 a.m., exactly the time Morrison had looked at the clock before speaking to me. Faulty wiring in the ventilation system, according to the official investigation. The 5 crew members had been working a deep cleaning shift when smoke filled the mess hall. The report stated they died from smoke inhalation before the fire suppression system activated. Quick deaths. Painless, the investigators claimed, though I doubted corpses could confirm that. What disturbed me most was what I found buried in maintenance records. The Caribbean Dream hadn't just been repaired after the fire. The entire galley and crew mess had been gutted and rebuilt. New equipment, new layout, new everything. But the company had kept the same hull number, the same ship registration. Legally, it was still the same vessel that had burned in 2009, even though the spaces where those 5 people died had been completely reconstructed. I started asking older crew members about the fire. Most refused to discuss it. But I finally found someone willing to talk. His name was Paulo, a Brazilian maintenance worker who'd been on the ship during the fire and had stayed through the reconstruction. They rebuilt everything, he told me over cigarettes on the crew deck at midnight. tore out the burned sections, installed all new materials. But something was wrong from the first day we reopened. Equipment would turn itself on, ovens heating to full temperature with no one touching the controls, coffee machines brewing pots with no water in the reservoir. And the mess hall, it was always cold in that back corner. 20 degrees colder than the rest of the space. Engineers checked it dozens of times, couldn't explain it. Did people see them? The crew who died? Paolo took a long drag from his cigarette. Night shift workers reported it first, said they saw crew members in outdated uniforms sitting in that corner. Management said it was grief, people seeing what they expected to see. But then the accident started. Night shift workers getting burned by equipment that wasn't hot. Finding themselves locked in freezers they knew they'd propped open. One woman claimed someone pushed her down the galley stairs, but security footage showed her falling alone. She said she felt hands, though. Cold hands. Why didn't they shut down the mess hall? Do something? Money, Miguel. Always money. You know what it costs to take a ship out of service. Millions per day. So they did what cruise lines do. They managed the problem quietly. Started warning night shift workers about the corner table. Told new hires like you not to acknowledge what you see. As long as no one gets seriously hurt and guests never find out, the ship keeps sailing. That night, I worked my shift with new understanding. The 5 figures appeared at 2:13 a.m. as usual, taking their places at the corner table. But now I could see details I'd missed before. Morrison's uniform had scorch marks on the sleeves. Chen's hair was singed short on one side. They weren't just ghosts. They were ghosts still wearing the injuries that killed them, trapped in an endless loop of their final shift. I tried to ignore them like Carlos had advised, but Morrison watched me with an intensity that made my hands shake as I refilled coffee pots. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the time of the fire, all 5 of them stood up. But instead of leaving, they walked toward me. I froze behind the counter as they approached, their translucent forms becoming slightly more solid with each step. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in clouds. The overhead lights flickered and struggled against some force that wanted darkness. Morrison stopped directly across the counter from me. Up close, I could see his eyes weren't hollow. They were burned, the pupils clouded white from exposure to intense heat and smoke. When he spoke, his voice carried the sound of crackling flames underneath the words. You researched us. You learned our names. You understand what happened. He reached out with a hand that passed through the counter like it wasn't there. That means you're connected now. You're part of the crew that was on duty when we died. And the ship remembers its crew, Miguel. It never lets them leave. I'm not part of your crew. That was 15 years ago. I wasn't even here. Chen stepped forward, and I could smell smoke, old and stale, clinging to her uniform. The ship doesn't care about linear time. We died here. We're still dying here. Every night at 2:17, we die again. The smoke fills our lungs again. The heat sears our skin again. And we're trapped in this moment forever, except for the hour between 2 and 3 a.m. when we can move, when we can try to warn people like you. Warn me about what? Schmidt spoke, his German accent thick, his voice like wind through burned timber. The ship consumed us. Our deaths fed it somehow. The hull number stayed the same, so our connection stayed intact. We're woven into the metal now, into the structure. And it's hungry, Miguel. It wants more crew members, more deaths to feed on. That's why the accidents happen. That's why people who acknowledge us start having problems. Okafor moved closer, and I could see bone through the burned flesh of his face. You broke the rule. You brought us coffee. You acknowledged we exist. Now the ship knows you can see us, and it will use that connection. Small things at first. Equipment malfunctions, near misses. But eventually, it will arrange your death, and you'll join us. Another crew member who can never leave their shift. Maria Reyes stood at the end of their line, and seeing my own last name on her uniform name tag made my stomach turn. She looked the youngest, most human. But when she spoke, her voice carried the same hollow distance as the others. I'm sorry, Miguel. I know what it's like to be trapped here. I was just trying to earn money for college. I didn't want to die. None of us did. But the ship took us anyway, and now it wants you too. The only way to break the connection is to leave before it's too late, before the accidents become fatal, before you end up sitting at our table wearing burns you can't heal, dying over and over every night at 2:17. The lights flickered violently, and I heard something I hadn't noticed before. Throughout the mess hall, equipment was turning itself on. Ovens heating, fryers igniting, coffee machines hissing. The temperature rose rapidly, smoke beginning to seep from the ventilation system. It was 2:17 a.m., and the fire was starting again. Run, Morrison said, already fading back toward transparency. We can only manifest for this hour. After 3 a.m., we disappear, and the ship takes full control. If you're still here, you'll burn with us. You'll become part of the pattern. I ran, burst through the mess hall doors into the corridor as alarms began to sound behind me. The automatic fire suppression system activated, sprinklers drenching the space I'd just fled. But I could still hear them. The 5 crew members who died in 2009, screaming as smoke and flame consumed them again, their voices echoing through the ventilation system throughout the entire ship. And I knew, with horrible certainty, that they were right. I'd acknowledged them. I'd connected to their pattern. And unless I got off this ship at the next port, I would eventually join them at that corner table, trapped forever in the moment of my death, dying again and again while the Caribbean dream sailed on. I had 2 days until we reached San Juan, where I'd planned to walk off the ship and never return. 2 days to avoid the accidents that had started immediately after my encounter with Morrison and the others. The fryer had exploded during my shift the next night, sending boiling oil across the galley floor seconds after I'd stepped away. The walk-in freezer door had locked with me inside, though I'd wedged it open with a crate. My hand had slipped while dicing vegetables, the knife cutting deep enough to need 7 stitches. Carlos noticed. Everyone on night shift noticed. They'd seen it happen to others who'd broken the unspoken rule. Just get to port, he'd whispered after the knife incident. 2 more days, Miguel. Keep your head down and survive 2 more days. But on my second to last shift, I arrived at the mess hall to find it completely empty. No engineers grabbing coffee, no housekeepers on their breaks. Just me and the industrial kitchen humming with refrigeration units and ventilation fans. The clock read 1:45 a.m., 30 minutes until they appeared. I went through my prep routine mechanically, brewing coffee, restocking supplies, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind off the corner table. But at exactly 2:13 a.m., they came. Not just the 5 I'd seen before. Dozens of them. They filed through the mess hall entrance in silent procession, crew members wearing uniforms from different eras spanning decades. Some had the burned flesh and singed clothing of fire victims. Others showed different injuries. Crushed limbs, drowned, waterlogged skin. One man's throat was cut ear to ear. They filled every table in the mess hall, sitting in perfect silence, all of them staring at me with those hollow, ruined eyes. I counted 32 crew members who shouldn't exist, who died on this ship over the years and somehow never left. The hull number had stayed the same through renovations and refits, and their deaths had bound them to the vessel permanently. At 2:17, they all stood up simultaneously. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor in perfect synchronization echoed through the empty mess hall like a death knell. They moved toward me, forming a circle around the counter where I stood frozen in terror. Not touching me, but close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from their translucent forms. Then they spoke, not individually, but in perfect unison. 32 voices creating a sound that seemed to come from the ship itself, from the metal walls and floor and ceiling. The voice of the Caribbean dream speaking through its collected dead. The ship is hungry. It has consumed us over decades, feeding on our deaths, growing stronger with each life it takes. But consumption requires balance. Every 15 years, it must feed deeply or it will tear itself apart. The last deep feeding was 15 years ago. The fire that took us 5. Before that, 1994. An engine room explosion that killed 12. Before that, 1979. A hull breach that drowned 18. Morrison stepped forward from the circle, his burned face inches from mine. We've been trying to warn people for years. The accidents increase before a major disaster. Small deaths building toward a catastrophic event. But no one listens. No one believes. And the company knows. They've known for decades. They track the pattern. They increase insurance before the feeding years. They transfer senior staff to other vessels. They leave the new crew, people like you, to die. What kind of disaster? My voice came out as a whisper. Maria Reyes answered, her young face twisted with sorrow. We don't know specifically. The ship decides. But it will be catastrophic. Enough deaths to satisfy its hunger for another 15 years. And it will happen in the next 48 hours. We can feel it building. The ship is preparing to tear itself apart and consume everyone aboard. Chen moved closer, and I could smell the smoke that permanently clung to her. You have to warn people. Get passengers to lifeboats. Alert the captain. Something. Anything. Because when it happens, it will be fast. No time to evacuate properly. The ship will make sure of that. Why are you telling me this? Why not warn everyone? The 32 dead crew members spoke in unison again, and the sound made the coffee cups rattle on their shelves. Because you're marked. You acknowledged us. You're connected to the ship's hunger now. You can feel it the way we do. You're already becoming part of the infrastructure, Miguel. In 2 days, you'll either die with the others or you'll join us. Either way, you're bound to this vessel. The ship has claimed you. At exactly 3 a.m., they vanished. All 32 of them disappeared between one breath and the next, leaving me alone in the mess hall with the knowledge that everyone aboard was going to die, and no one would believe me if I tried to warn them. I went straight to the bridge, demanded to speak to the captain. Security thought I was having a breakdown, but I was persistent enough that the first officer agreed to see me. I told him everything. The dead crew members, the pattern of disasters every 15 years, the warning about a catastrophic event in the next 48 hours. He listened patiently, checked my employee file, and called the ship's doctor. Mr. Reyes, you've been working excessive hours on night shift. The isolation can cause paranoid delusions. We're going to have you evaluated and give you some time off. I'm not crazy. Check your records. This ship has had major disasters in 1979, 1994, and 2009, exactly 15 years apart. We're in 2024. We're in the pattern window. Something flickered in the first officer's expression. Recognition, maybe, or confirmation of something he already knew. Those were unfortunate accidents, yes, but they were investigated thoroughly. Equipment failures, nothing supernatural. Then why do senior officers always transfer off this ship in year 15 of the cycle? Why does corporate increase insurance coverage? Why are there warnings in the maintenance logs about the crew mess corner table? The first officer's face hardened. "You're dismissed, Mr. Reyes. Report to medical for evaluation, or you'll be confined to quarters for the remainder of the voyage." They knew. The company knew. They were just hoping it wouldn't be as bad this time, or that they could manage the aftermath like they had before. Balance the deaths against the cost of taking the ship out of service. Calculate that 15-year disasters were more profitable than permanent decommissioning. I walked off the bridge knowing I'd failed. No one was going to evacuate. No one was going to prepare. And in less than 48 hours, the Caribbean Dream was going to claim more crew members for its collection of ghosts. The disaster came 36 hours later, at 2:17 a.m., of course. I was in my cabin, packing my belongings, counting the hours until we'd reached San Juan. The explosion in the engine room shook the entire ship. Alarms screamed throughout every deck. The lights failed. Emergency lighting kicked in, painting everything in blood-red shadows. I ran for my muster station, joining the panicked flow of crew and passengers moving through corridors that had begun to tilt. The ship was listing, taking on water faster than the pumps could manage. Another explosion rocked the vessel, this one closer. People were screaming, crying, pushing toward lifeboats that wouldn't accommodate everyone aboard. I made it to the crew deck and saw them. Morrison and the others, standing calmly amid the chaos. But they weren't alone anymore. Fresh crew members stood with them, their uniforms still intact, their bodies not yet showing the injuries that killed them. Engineers from the explosion, a security guard crushed by a collapsing bulkhead, a housekeeper who'd been trapped when the watertight doors sealed. The death toll was rising, and the ship was feeding. Maria Reyes walked toward me through the panicking crowd. People passed through her translucent form without noticing. She stopped inches away, and I could see my own terror reflected in her dead eyes. 73 crew, 142 passengers. That's how many will die before the ship stabilizes. The hull will breach in 3 more places. The lifeboats will fail to launch. And when it's over, when the ship is rescued and repaired, we'll all still be here. The dead who can never leave, including you, Miguel. I looked down at my hands. They were translucent. I could see the deck through my palms. The ship had already claimed me. I died in one of those explosions, or I was dying now, or I would die in the next few minutes. Time didn't work right anymore. I was becoming part of the pattern, just like they'd warned. The last thing I remember clearly is the water rushing through the corridor. Cold. So cold. And Morrison's voice welcoming me to permanent night shift, telling me I'd be working the crew mess from 2 to 3 a.m. every night for eternity. Telling me to watch for the next crew member who'd break the rule and acknowledge our existence, because they'd need to be warned about the next feeding. The next one is in 2039, 15 years from now. And I'll be sitting at that corner table waiting to deliver the message that no one will believe. Just another ghost trapped on a ship that feeds on its crew, sailing endlessly while carrying its collection of dead workers who can never clock out, never go home, never escape the vessel that consumed them. Welcome to permanent night shift. The mess hall is always open, and we're always hiring. I discovered the keys during my 3rd month working housekeeping on the Ocean Majesty. We were conducting annual inventory in the master storage room, counting linens and supplies, when I found a locked metal cabinet tucked behind shelving units that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. The cabinet wasn't on our inventory list, and my supervisor, Carmen, had no idea what was inside. "Probably just old paperwork," she said, already moving to the next section. "Corporate never throws anything away." But I was curious. The lock was old but functional, and after trying various master keys from our collection, I found one that fit. Inside were rows of brass cabin keys, the old-fashioned kind that cruise ships stopped using a decade ago when everything went electronic. Each key had a number stamped on it: 1301, 1302, 1303. The sequence continued through 1348. I pulled out several keys, examining them in the fluorescent light. "Carmen, why do we have keys for Deck 13? We don't have a Deck 13. She stopped counting pillowcases and turned slowly. When she saw what I was holding, her face went pale. "Where did you find those?" "In this cabinet. There are at least 40 keys here, all numbered for Deck 13. Carmen took the keys from my hand like they were dangerous, carefully placing them back in the cabinet. "Elena, the Ocean Majesty doesn't have a Deck 13. Look at any ship diagram. We go from Deck 12 to Deck 14. 13 was skipped during construction. Superstition." "Then why do we have keys for 48 cabins that don't exist?" She closed the cabinet and turned the lock. "Some things are maintained for historical purposes. Legacy systems, it doesn't concern us." But her hands were shaking as she put the cabinet key back on its hook. "Let's finish this inventory. And Elena, don't mention those keys to anyone else. It's not worth the confusion it would cause." But I couldn't let it go. That night, I pulled up the ship's blueprints on the crew computer system. Carmen was right. The official deck plans showed 12 passenger decks, then jumped directly to 14. No 13th deck existed in any schematic. But when I examined the ship's exterior profile, something didn't add up. The spacing between decks 12 and 14 was twice as large as any other deck spacing. There was room for an entire additional deck in that gap. I started asking other housekeepers if they'd ever heard of Deck 13. Most looked at me like I was crazy. But one woman, Rosa, who'd been working ships for 20 years, pulled me aside during our break. "You found the keys, didn't you?" She lit a cigarette, her hands trembling slightly. "I've worked 4 different ships, and they all have the same thing. A hidden deck that officially doesn't exist. Fully constructed cabins, completely furnished, but locked and sealed. No passengers ever book them, no crew ever service them. They just sit there, empty and waiting." "Waiting for what?" Rosa took a long drag. "I don't know. But I worked on the Pacific Star 5 years ago when a maintenance crew was sent to inspect Deck 13 because of water leaks. 3 men went in, 2 came back. The third, they found him 3 days later wandering Deck 9, completely incoherent. Kept saying the cabins weren't empty, that there were people in there who'd been waiting a long time. He was institutionalized. Company paid his family a settlement and sealed those cabins permanently." "Are you saying Deck 13 exists on this ship? Physically exists?" "It exists on every ship in this fleet. 48 cabins per deck, all locked, all forbidden. And Elena, people who get too curious about those decks have a habit of requesting transfers or quitting without explanation. My advice? Forget you saw those keys. Forget we had this conversation. Work your contract and move on." But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about 48 empty cabins, sitting in the space between 2 official decks. A deck that existed physically, but had been erased from all documentation. I pulled out my phone and started researching the Ocean Majesty's construction history. The ship had been built in 2008, but there was a gap in the construction timeline. Work had stopped for 6 months between deck installation and interior finishing. No explanation was given in the public records, but I found a buried news article about a labor dispute. 12 construction workers had died during the build, all from accidents on what the article vaguely referred to as the disputed deck level. 12 deaths, 48 cabins, and a deck that officially didn't exist but physically occupied space in the ship's structure. I realized with growing dread that I was looking at exactly what Rosa had warned me about. A deck built with death woven into its foundation. A deck the company had decided was too contaminated or too cursed to ever acknowledge publicly. The question was whether those 12 construction workers had ever left, or whether they were still there, occupying cabins on a deck that no one would ever visit, waiting for someone curious enough to unlock the doors and discover what happens to spaces built on top of graves. I looked at the cabinet key I'd quietly pocketed during inventory. It was small, insignificant, but it could open a cabinet full of keys that would unlock an entire deck of secrets. And despite Rosa's warning, despite every logical part of my brain screaming at me to return the key and forget about Deck 13, I knew I was going to use it. Because I had to know what was in those cabins. I had to understand why an entire deck would be hidden. And most of all, I needed to find out if those construction workers had ever stopped working their shifts, or if Deck 13 was still occupied by crew members who'd never clocked out. I waited 3 days before making my move, studying crew schedules and security camera placements. The stairwell between decks 12 and 14 showed a locked door marked "Maintenance Only, Authorized Personnel" that I'd passed hundreds of times without thinking twice. But now I understood. That door led to Deck 13. I retrieved the cabinet keys during my night shift when the storage room was empty, my heart pounding as I selected several cabin keys and pocketed them. The master access key that opened the maintenance door was easier to obtain than I'd expected. Carmen kept it on her key ring, and she always left her keys in her locker during meal breaks. At 2 a.m., when most crew were either working or sleeping, I made my way to the forbidden stairwell. The maintenance door opened smoothly, revealing stairs that descended into darkness. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows as I moved down, the air growing noticeably colder with each step. At the bottom was another door, this one marked simply 13. The door wasn't locked. It opened into a corridor that made my breath catch. The hallway was perfectly preserved from decades ago, with carpeting in a pattern I recognized from vintage cruise ship photographs. The wallpaper was faded but intact, showing Art Deco designs popular in the 1960s. Wall sconces provided dim lighting, suggesting the deck still had power despite being officially non-existent. I walked slowly down the corridor, my footsteps muffled by the old carpeting. Cabin doors lined both sides, numbered 1301 through 1348. Unlike modern cabin doors with electronic locks, these had old brass hardware and physical keyholes. Everything looked frozen in time, preserved exactly as it had been over 60 years ago. I tried the first key in cabin 1312. The lock turned smoothly, and the door opened into a perfectly maintained stateroom. The furniture was vintage, the bed made with crisp sheets. Fresh flowers sat in a vase on the desk. But the flowers were plastic, coated in dust. And when I touched the bedspread, my hand came away covered in a fine powder that smelled chemical and wrong. On the desk, I found a leather-bound journal. The first entry was dated March 5, 1964, written in elegant cursive, "Boarded today for our anniversary cruise." Robert surprised me with an upgrade to Deck 13. The steward says it's the newest edition, just opened this year. How exciting. I flipped through more entries, watching the handwriting deteriorate. March 7th. Several passengers on our deck have taken ill. Ship's doctor says it's seasickness. March 9th. Robert has developed a fever. I feel unwell too. The steward won't enter our cabin anymore. He leaves trays outside the door. March 11th. People are dying. I can hear them through the walls. The ship has quarantined our entire deck. No one is allowed to leave. The final entry was barely legible. March 13th. Everyone on this deck is dead or dying. The illness spreads too fast. Ship's doctor says they've never seen anything like it. They're going to seal the deck. Lock us in. Robert died this morning. I can feel the fever burning me from inside. I don't want to die alone in... The entry ended mid-sentence. I dropped the journal, my hands shaking. The plastic flowers, the preserved room, the chemical smell. This cabin had been sealed with its occupants still inside. I moved to the closet and found vintage clothing hanging neatly. Behind the clothes, wrapped in plastic sheeting, was a body, mummified by the chemicals they'd used to seal the deck, perfectly preserved, still wearing a nightgown from 1964. I stumbled out of the cabin and ran to the next door, unlocked it with trembling hands. Another preserved room, another journal with similar entries, another body in the closet. I checked 5 more cabins. Same pattern, all occupied, all sealed with their passengers still inside. The illness had killed 32 passengers and 18 crew members, according to Rosa. 50 people total. And instead of properly handling the bodies, instead of investigating the outbreak, the cruise line had simply sealed the entire deck, pumped it full of preservative chemicals, and pretended it never existed. Erased it from the ship's documentation. Skipped the number 13 on all future deck plans. I was backing toward the exit when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the dusty carpet. Not mine. These prints led from cabin 1348 to the stairwell and back. Multiple sets suggesting regular traffic. Someone else had been coming to deck 13. Recently, frequently. I followed the prints to cabin 1348 and pressed my ear to the door. Inside, I heard movement. Soft footsteps. The rustle of fabric. Someone was in there. Someone was living in a cabin that should have been sealed and abandoned for 60 years. I knocked before I could stop myself. Hello? Is someone there? The movement stopped. Silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then a voice, thin and crackling like old radio static, answered from behind the door. Finally. We've been waiting so long for someone to find us. The sickness never left, you see. It's still here, still growing. And now that you've breathed the air on this deck, now that you've touched the contaminated surfaces, you're infected too. Just like we were. Just like everyone who ever stepped foot on deck 13. The door opened slowly. Standing in the doorway was a woman wearing a 1960s stewardess uniform, her skin gray and waxy, her eyes clouded with cataracts. Behind her, I could see more figures. Passengers and crew members, all wearing vintage clothing, all showing the same preserved, mummified appearance. The company thought they could contain the outbreak by sealing us in. The stewardess continued, her voice like wind through a tomb. But the illness doesn't die. It waits. And now you've released it again by opening these doors. It will spread through the ship just like it did in 1964. And when it's over, they'll seal another deck. Add more cabins to the spaces that don't officially exist. More bodies preserved in chemical darkness. More crew and passengers trapped forever in rooms that no one will acknowledge. I ran, burst through the stairwell door back to Deck 12, my lungs burning, my skin crawling with the certainty that I'd been infected. Behind me, I heard dozens of doors opening on Deck 13, heard footsteps shuffling into the corridor, heard voices calling out in languages and accents from 60 years ago, all of them saying the same thing. Don't leave. You're one of us now. The sickness binds us. You'll be back soon. And when you die, they'll put you in one of the empty cabins. They'll seal you in with chemicals and lies. And you'll wait, just like we waited, for the next person curious enough to unlock the doors and start the cycle again. The symptoms started 12 hours after I left Deck 13. A mild fever at first, the kind I tried to dismiss as stress or exhaustion from working double shifts. But by evening, my temperature had spiked to 103 degrees. The ship's doctor examined me in the medical bay, frowning at readings that didn't match any known illness. "Have you been exposed to anything unusual?" he asked, taking a blood sample. "Any areas of the ship you don't normally access?" I should have told him the truth. Should have explained about Deck 13, the preserved bodies, the contaminated air I'd breathed for nearly an hour. But something stopped me. Creeping paranoia that whispered if I admitted what I'd done, I'd end up sealed in one of those cabins myself. Another body wrapped in plastic sheeting for the next curious person to discover. No, I lied. Just the usual housekeeping rounds. He gave me fever reducers and told me to rest. But rest was impossible. That night, lying in my cabin, I heard them. Voices seeping through the ventilation system, whispers in accents from decades past, speaking languages I didn't understand, but somehow comprehended perfectly. They were calling to me, telling me to come back to Deck 13, telling me I belonged there now. By the third day, the paranoia had consumed rational thought. I became convinced my roommate was poisoning my food, that Carmen was reporting my behavior to corporate, that the other housekeepers could smell the sickness on me and were deliberately avoiding my presence. I started seeing the mummified passengers everywhere, standing in corridors, watching from empty cabins, following me during my shifts with their clouded, dead eyes. I attacked another crew member on the fourth day, a dishwasher who made the mistake of brushing past me in the crew mess. Something in my fever-addled brain interpreted his touch as aggression, as infection spreading. And I grabbed a fork and stabbed him in the shoulder before security pulled me off. The violence erupted from nowhere, a primal need to protect myself from contamination that was already consuming me from within. They restrained me in the medical bay, sedated me. And while I drifted in chemical haze, I heard the doctor on the phone with someone in corporate. His words filtered through the fog of medication. Yes, it matches the historical symptoms exactly. Fever, paranoia, violent psychosis, auditory hallucinations. I don't know how she contracted it. The deck has been sealed for 60 years. The contamination should be completely inert by now. A pause. No, we can't airlift her off. Not without alerting passengers. And if this is what I think it is, if the 1964 pathogen is somehow still active. Another pause, longer this time. Understood. I'll prepare the quarantine protocols and contact her family with the standard settlement offer. I tried to speak, to scream, to tell them I wouldn't go quietly into whatever isolation they'd prepared. But my tongue was thick with sedation, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. Through my blurred vision, I saw the stewardess from Deck 13 standing in the corner of the medical bay. She smiled with gray, cracked lips. "They're going to seal you away," she whispered, her voice cutting through the medication. "Just like they sealed us. But you won't die alone in a cabin. Medical quarantine is different. Slower. You'll feel every stage of the illness, every symptom those passengers in 1964 experienced. And when you finally die, they'll cremate your body at sea and tell your family it was a tragic accident." The fever peaked on the 7th day. My temperature reached 107 degrees. I should have died, my brain cooking inside my skull. But the illness wouldn't let me die. It wanted me conscious, aware, suffering through every moment as my organs slowly failed and my mind fractured into pieces that couldn't reassemble into coherent thought. They moved me to a sealed room deep in the ship's medical section, a space that didn't appear on any deck plans. A room designed specifically for containing outbreaks that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The walls were thick plastic sheeting. The air filtration system hummed constantly, and through the transparent barrier, I could see doctors in hazmat suits observing me like a laboratory specimen. My family was contacted on the 8th day. I heard the doctor through the intercom, his voice professionally sympathetic, explaining that I'd contracted a rare illness, that everything possible was being done, that the company would cover all medical expenses and provide compensation for their loss. I wanted to scream, to tell them it was a lie, that I was being murdered by a 60-year-old pathogen the company had tried to bury on a non-existent deck. But my vocal cords had stopped working. The illness had paralyzed my throat, leaving me capable only of strangled whimpers. The mummified passengers visited me constantly. They passed through the plastic barriers like they weren't there, gathering around my bed, touching my burning skin with their preserved fingers. More of them appeared each day. Not just the 50 from Deck 13, but others. Crew members who died on this ship over decades. Passengers who'd succumbed to illnesses that were never properly investigated. All of them trapped in the infrastructure, bound to the vessel by deaths the company had concealed. "You're becoming one of us," the stewardess explained on the 10th day. "The illness doesn't just kill, it transforms. It binds your consciousness to the ship. When your body dies, you'll join us. Another ghost trapped in spaces that don't officially exist. Another secret the company keeps sealed behind locked doors and erased deck plans." On the 12th day, I felt my body beginning to shut down. My heart rate had become irregular, my breathing shallow. The doctors had stopped trying to treat me and were simply documenting my decline for whatever research purposes corporate had authorized. I could see resignation in their eyes when they looked at me through the plastic barrier. They knew I was dying. They'd probably known from the first day. But I wasn't afraid of death anymore. What terrified me was what came after. Because I could feel the ship now. Feel its hunger. Feel how it consumed the dead and wove their consciousness into its structure. I was becoming part of the ocean majesty, my awareness spreading through ventilation systems and electrical wiring, through the hidden spaces between official decks where bodies lay preserved and forgotten. I died on the 14th day. My heart stopped at 2:17 a.m., the same time of death recorded for most of the passengers on Deck 13 in 1964. But death wasn't an ending. It was a transition. My consciousness remained. Trapped in the quarantine room, watching as doctors confirmed my death and prepared my body for disposal. Watching as they sealed my contaminated remains in a metal container. Watching as they carried me through crew corridors to the incinerator that would erase all physical evidence I'd ever existed. But they couldn't erase me. I was already part of the ship. I can move through the vessel now, passing through walls and locked doors, existing in spaces passengers and crew will never see. I've found the others like me, Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, accumulated over decades of deaths the company deemed too expensive or too damaging to acknowledge publicly. We gather in the hidden places, in Deck 13 with the mummified passengers, in sealed cargo holds where workers died in accidents that were never properly investigated, in the spaces between official decks where the ship's darkest secrets rot in chemical darkness. And we wait. Because the Ocean Majesty is still sailing, still carrying passengers who have no idea they're traveling on a vessel built on graves and sealed with lies. Still employing crew members who will eventually become curious about doors that should never be opened and decks that don't officially exist. I see Elena sometimes, the living Elena, still working her housekeeping shifts. She doesn't remember going to Deck 13. The company altered her medical records, told her she'd had a severe mental breakdown from work stress, gave her medication that clouded her memories of everything that happened. She's finishing her contract, planning to leave at the next port, believing she survived whatever illness briefly hospitalized her. But I know the truth. Part of her is already infected. The illness has a long incubation period, sometimes months or years. And eventually, when she's far from the ship, living her life on land, the symptoms will return. The fever, the paranoia, the voices. And she'll understand, far too late, that you can't escape the Ocean Majesty once it's claimed you. The ship never lets its crew go. We're all working permanent contracts now. And the next time someone finds those keys, the next time someone unlocks a door to a deck that shouldn't exist, we'll be waiting to welcome them, to show them what happens to people who discover the company's secrets, to help them understand that some illnesses never die. They just wait for new hosts. And this ship has eternity to find them. I'd been the safety compliance officer on the Atlantic Voyager for 8 months when the incident occurred. My job was straightforward: conduct weekly safety drills, inspect life-saving equipment, ensure the ship met all maritime regulations. It was bureaucratic and boring, exactly what I wanted after spending 6 years in the Coast Guard dealing with actual emergencies. The life raft deployed during a routine inspection on a calm Tuesday morning. I was checking the starboard side equipment with my assistant Carlos when one of the automatic release mechanisms malfunctioned. The raft inflated and broke free from its mounting before we could secure it, tumbling over the railing and into the Caribbean Sea below. Damn it, Carlos muttered, already radioing the bridge. That's a $15,000 raft just floating away. Captain's going to be furious. I watched through binoculars as the orange raft drifted in our wake, growing smaller as the Atlantic Voyager continued its course toward Nassau. Tag the GPS coordinates. We'll file the incident report and the company will send a recovery vessel. These things happen. But as I logged the raft's identification number into the system, something made me pause. The number was familiar. I pulled up our equipment inventory and felt my stomach drop. Life Raft Alpha 73 had been officially listed as lost at sea 2 years ago during Hurricane Melissa. It had deployed during the storm when 20-foot waves battered the ship, and 3 crew members, 2 engineers, and a deckhand had reportedly been swept overboard trying to secure it. Carlos, are you sure we pulled this raft from starboard position 12? Positive. Why? Because according to our records, this raft was lost in 2022. It shouldn't exist anymore. Carlos looked at the inventory screen, his face paling. That's impossible. I inspected that mounting position last week. The raft was definitely there, and the serial number matched our current inventory. I spent the rest of the day trying to reconcile the discrepancy. The raft that had just deployed was definitely Alpha 73, with manufacturing marks and inspection stickers matching the one lost during the hurricane. But our current inventory showed a different raft should have been in that position, purchased as a replacement after the storm. Somehow, the original lost raft had returned and replaced its successor without anyone noticing. 3 days later, at 2:30 a.m., I received a call from the bridge. A night watch officer had spotted something in the water, illuminated by our searchlights. An orange life raft, drifting alongside the ship, matching our speed perfectly despite having no propulsion system. I reached the deck to find the crew already deploying recovery equipment. The life raft was Alpha 73, the same one that had drifted away 3 days ago. But this time, it wasn't empty. Through the raft's observation window, I could see 3 figures lying motionless inside. The recovery took 20 minutes. When we finally hauled the raft onto the deck and opened it, I understood why the night watch officer had sounded terrified on the phone. The 3 figures were crew members. More specifically, they were the 3 crew members who'd been swept overboard 2 years ago during Hurricane Melissa. I recognized them from the memorial service the company had held. Marcus Chen, senior engineer, David Okonkwo, junior engineer, and James Morrison, deckhand. All 3 were unconscious but breathing, wearing the same uniforms they'd disappeared in, showing no obvious injuries or signs of exposure. Their skin was pale and cold to the touch, but they had pulses. They were alive. The ship's doctor examined them in the medical bay while I stood by, trying to process what I was witnessing. Their vital signs are weak but stable, he reported. Body temperature is severely hypothermic, but there's no frostbite. No dehydration despite being at sea for, what did you say, 3 days? 2 years, I corrected. These men have been missing for 2 years. They were declared dead. The company paid death benefits to their families. The doctor stared at me. That's impossible. These men are malnourished, certainly. But they couldn't have survived 2 years adrift in a life raft. 3 weeks, maybe. A month at most without water. 2 years is absolutely impossible. But the medical evidence was undeniable. When blood tests came back, they showed severe vitamin deficiencies consistent with prolonged malnutrition. Their hair and nails had grown, though not as much as 2 years should have produced. It was as if they'd been in some kind of suspended animation, their bodies aging at a drastically reduced rate while drifting in that life raft. I pulled the security footage from 2 years ago, watching the grainy recording of Hurricane Melissa battering our ship. There they were, Chen, Okonkwo, and Morrison, struggling to secure equipment on the deck as waves crashed over the railings. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. Then, a massive wave hit. The camera angle tilted violently, and when the image stabilized, all 3 men were gone. The life raft they'd been working near had deployed and vanished into the storm. The company sent investigators within hours of us reporting the recovery. Corporate lawyers, medical specialists, and maritime officials descended on the Atlantic Voyager, all demanding answers to questions I couldn't begin to explain. How had these men survived 2 years at sea? Where had they been? And most importantly, how had the life raft returned to our ship twice, first replacing itself in our inventory, then appearing alongside us with its lost crew miraculously alive? The 3 men remained unconscious for 2 days. The medical team kept them sedated and hydrated, running every test available, but finding no medical explanation for their survival. Their bodies showed exposure to prolonged sunlight, salt water, and starvation. But the damage was inconsistent with 2 years of such exposure. It was as if they'd experienced compressed time, living through months or weeks that should have been years. When Marcus Chen finally woke on the 3rd day, his first words made everyone in the medical bay go silent. "What day is it?" "November 7th, 2024, the doctor answered gently. You've been missing for 2 years. Do you remember what happened? Chen's face crumpled with confusion and horror. 2 years? No. We deployed the life raft 3 days ago, during the storm. We were trying to save it and we got swept over. But it was just 3 days ago. We drifted for 3 days. How can it be 2 years? He was telling the truth. I could see it in his eyes. For him, for all 3 of them, only 3 days had passed since Hurricane Melissa. They had no memory of the missing time, no awareness that 730 days had vanished from their lives while they drifted in that life raft, somehow preserved in a pocket of distorted time that had only now released them back to our reality. The medical tests became more invasive as doctors tried to understand what had happened to Chen, Okonkwo, and Morrison. Carbon dating of their hair samples confirmed growth consistent with only 3 to 4 days, not 2 years. Their muscle atrophy suggested severe malnutrition, but their organ function showed they'd been receiving just enough sustenance to survive. It was as if they'd been kept in stasis, their bodies functioning at the absolute minimum level required to maintain life. I sat with Chen during his 4th day of consciousness, hoping he could provide details that might explain the impossible. He looked gaunt and haunted, his eyes constantly darting to the window as if expecting something to appear. Tell me everything you remember, I said gently. From the moment you went overboard. Chen's hands trembled as he gripped his water cup. The wave hit us. I remember the cold, the complete disorientation of being underwater. Then somehow I was in the life raft with David and James. We'd been thrown into it or pulled, I'm not sure which. The storm was still raging, waves tossing us like a toy. How long did the storm last? Hours, maybe. When it finally calmed, we were alone. No ship in sight. We had the emergency supplies in the raft, water rations, food packs, flares. We figured we'd be rescued within a day or 2. The ship would have sent our last known position. And then what happened? Chen's expression became distant, confused. We waited. We rationed the supplies carefully. We took turns watching for ships or aircraft. But here's the thing, Thomas. The sun never moved. It stayed in the same position in the sky the entire time, day after day, or what felt like days. But the sun stayed fixed, like time had stopped. That's impossible. I know, but all 3 of us saw it. We'd sleep, wake up, and the sun would be in the exact same position. We started wondering if we were hallucinating from dehydration, but we had water. We were following the protocols, and we all saw the same thing, so it couldn't have been individual delusions. I made notes, trying to find some rational explanation. What about the supplies? When did they run out? They didn't. That's what scared us most. We'd eat a ration pack, drink water, and the next time we checked, the supplies were back, full, like they'd never been consumed. We tested it. We'd deliberately empty the water containers and count the remaining food packets. Then we'd sleep. And when we woke up, everything was restored to the original amount. You're saying the supplies were regenerating? I'm saying we were trapped in some kind of loop. Time wasn't passing normally. The supplies weren't regenerating. They were resetting. Every cycle, everything went back to how it was at the beginning. Except us. We kept getting weaker. We could feel our bodies deteriorating even though we were eating and drinking. It was like the food wasn't real, wasn't actually nourishing us. Okonkwo and Morrison told identical stories when I interviewed them separately. The fixed sun, the regenerating supplies, the sensation of being trapped in a moment that repeated endlessly while their bodies slowly starved despite having food and water. All 3 men insisted they'd been in the raft for only 3 days by their perception. But those 3 days had somehow stretched across 2 years. The Maritime Investigation Team arrived on the 5th day with specialized equipment. They examined the life raft with radiation detectors, electromagnetic sensors, and instruments I didn't recognize. The raft itself appeared completely normal, a standard maritime survival craft with no unusual properties. But when they checked the emergency supplies still stored inside, they found something disturbing. The food packets and water containers had expiration dates from 2022, but chemical analysis showed the contents were fresh, as if manufactured yesterday. The batteries in the emergency radio and beacon were fully charged despite 2 years of potential degradation. Everything inside the raft existed in a state that defied the passage of time. It's like the raft entered a pocket dimension, one of the investigators theorized. A space where time flows differently or doesn't flow at all. The men experienced 3 days subjectively, while 2 years passed in normal reality. But their bodies were still subject to entropy, still aging and deteriorating, just at a drastically slower rate than the external world. That's science fiction, I argued. Pockets of altered time don't exist. Then how do you explain 3 men surviving 2 years at sea with 3 days of supplies? How do you explain them not aging? How do you explain the raft returning to your ship twice, first replacing itself in your inventory, then delivering its crew back to you? I had no answers. None of us did. The company classified the entire incident, confiscating all evidence and swearing everyone involved to silence with NDAs, backed by severe financial penalties. The 3 rescued crew members were placed under observation in a private medical facility, officially listed as recovering from their ordeal, but effectively imprisoned for study. I visited Chen one final time before corporate barred all access. He looked worse than when he'd first woken, his skin gray, his breathing labored. The doctors couldn't explain his deteriorating condition. All tests showed he should be recovering, but instead he was dying. "It's pulling us back," he whispered when I entered his room. "We can feel it. The raft, the place we were trapped. It doesn't want to let us go. Every night, we have the same dream. We're back in the raft, drifting in that frozen moment where time doesn't pass, the sun fixed in the sky, the supplies resetting. And something else is there with us now. Something that's been waiting in that timeless space. Something that wants us to return. That's just trauma. Post-traumatic stress from your experience." Chen grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "We all have the exact same dream, Thomas. Down to every detail. That's not PTSD. That's a message. The raft is calling us back. And I think it's calling the ship too. How else do you explain it returning? It didn't drift back randomly. It came looking for us. And now that it's found us, now that we're back on board, I think it's planning to take more than just us 3. He died that night. Heart failure, the doctors said, though his heart had been functioning normally hours before. Okonkwo died 2 days later. Morrison lasted a week, growing weaker each day despite every medical intervention available. All 3 men died with the same expression, eyes wide with terror, staring at something the rest of us couldn't see, reaching toward an invisible presence that only they could perceive. The company cremated their bodies at sea and sealed all records. Official cause of death was listed as complications from prolonged exposure and malnutrition. The families received substantial settlements in exchange for signing agreements never to discuss the circumstances of the men's disappearance or miraculous return. I should have left it alone. Should have accepted the NDAs and moved on with my life. But I couldn't stop thinking about Chen's final words. The raft calling them back. the something waiting in that timeless space, the implication that the ship itself might be at risk. 2 months later, during a routine safety inspection, I discovered that Life Raft Alpha 73 was back in its mounting position. The same raft, the same serial number. Somehow, after being confiscated by investigators and supposedly destroyed, it had returned again and reinstalled itself in our inventory without anyone noticing or documenting the replacement. And now I see them sometimes, late at night when I'm conducting inspections. Chen, Okonkwo, and Morrison, standing near the life raft mounting, staring at the orange canister, their translucent forms flickering in and out of visibility. They died, but they're still here, still trapped in whatever timeless space that raft connected to. Still trying to warn me about something that's waiting. Because the raft hasn't finished. Whatever it was designed to do, whatever purpose it serves as a doorway to a place where time doesn't flow normally, it's still active. Still waiting for the next storm, the next accident, the next crew members who'll be pulled into that frozen moment and kept there until the raft decides to release them. If it ever decides to release them. I found Morrison in the medical bay 3 nights after Chen died, standing at the window with his hands pressed against the glass, staring at the dark ocean below. His eyes were open but unfocused, like he was sleepwalking. When I touched his shoulder, he turned to me with an expression of desperate longing. "I need to go back," he whispered. "It's calling. Can't you hear it? The water sounds different now. It's singing in the same frequency as the raft, the same timeless rhythm." Security found Okonkwo on the deck at 4 a.m., climbing over the railing. It took 3 officers to pull him back, and the entire time he was screaming that he needed to return, that the water was waiting, that time had stopped, and he was the only thing still moving forward. The doctors sedated them both and installed restraints, but it didn't stop the synchronized deterioration. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., both men would wake simultaneously, thrashing against their bonds, begging to be released into the ocean. They described identical nightmares, trapped in the life raft, the sun frozen in the sky. But now something massive moving beneath them in a water that had become thick as oil. Something ancient that had learned to exist in spaces where time didn't flow. And now it wanted them back, wanted to study them, consume them, add them to its collection of things pulled out of normal reality. Morrison tried to bite through his own wrist veins on the 6th night. Said if he couldn't walk to the ocean, his blood would find its way there. Okonkwo stopped eating entirely, claiming food was an anchor to linear time, and he needed to become light enough to slip back through to where he belonged. On the 8th night, I was reviewing security footage when I saw it. The life raft mounting position on the starboard deck. Alpha 73 was glowing faintly in the darkness, pulsing with bioluminescent light that shouldn't exist on manufactured equipment. And standing around it in a circle were dozens of translucent figures. Crew members from across decades, all of them drowned or lost at sea, all of them drawn to this raft that served as a beacon between our reality and wherever they'd been taken. Chen appeared on the footage, more solid than the others, walking toward the raft with purpose. He reached out and touched the canister, and the pulsing light intensified. The ocean itself seemed to respond, waves rising higher, reaching toward the ship like grasping fingers. I ran to the deck, but I was too late. The raft had deployed itself, inflating and tumbling into the water below. And standing at the railing where it had been mounted were Morrison and Okonkwo, somehow free from their restraints, blood streaming from their wrists where they'd torn through the bindings. They looked at me with eyes that reflected the bioluminescent glow from the water. "It's time to go home," Morrison said calmly. "Our 3 days are finally ending. We can move forward now, just not in this direction." They jumped together, disappearing into the dark water. I called for emergency response, but when searchlights illuminated the area, there was nothing. No bodies, no life raft. Just smooth, black ocean that seemed somehow thicker than water should be. More viscous, like it belonged to a different reality where physical laws operated differently. The next morning, Life Raft Alpha 73 was back in its mounting position, fully secured as if it had never deployed. And in the medical bay where Morrison and Okonkwo had been restrained, their beds were empty but not vacant. The impressions of their bodies remained on the sheets, and written in condensation on the window they'd stared through every night were coordinates. I entered the coordinates into the navigation system and felt my blood turn to ice. They marked a location in the Atlantic Ocean where 17 ships had vanished over the past century. Not sunk, vanished, disappeared completely with all hands, leaving no wreckage, no survivors, no explanation. A spot where multiple Shanghai authorities had documented temporal anomalies, compass malfunctions, and reports from passing vessels of seeing ghost ships that vanished when approached. The Atlantic Voyager was scheduled to pass directly through those coordinates in 48 hours. And I understood with horrible certainty that the raft had been planning this all along. It hadn't returned randomly. It had installed itself on our ship deliberately, waiting for us to reach the location where the barrier between realities was thinnest, where it could pull the entire vessel through into that timeless space it had shown to Chen, Okonkwo, and Morrison. I reported everything to the captain, begging him to alter course. He looked at the coordinates, looked at me, and I saw recognition in his eyes. He knew about that location. Corporate had briefed him, and they'd ordered him to maintain course anyway. "Thomas, some things are bigger than individual ships or crew members. That rift, or whatever it is, has been pulling vessels through for over a century. Corporate has been studying it, trying to understand it, hoping to harness whatever technology or phenomenon creates pockets of altered time. Your 3 survivors were the first people to ever return. That makes this ship, this crew, invaluable for research. You're going to deliberately sail us into an anomaly that swallowed 17 ships? We're going to collect data as we approach. And if something happens, if we cross through, Corporate will finally have answers about where those ships went and whether the crews survived in some kind of temporal bubble. Your friends proved people can survive there. Maybe hundreds of crew members from those lost vessels are still alive, just trapped in slowed time, waiting for rescue. I'm writing this 45 minutes before we reach the coordinates. Life Raft Alpha 73 is glowing brighter with each nautical mile we travel. The ghosts of drowned crew members are gathering on deck, more of them materializing every hour, all of them staring at the water with anticipation. The ocean itself looks wrong now. Too dark, too thick, moving in patterns that don't match wind or current. Chen appeared in my cabin an hour ago, more solid than he's ever been. He sat on my bunk and smiled sadly. "You tried to warn them, Thomas. But the ship wants to cross over. It's been calling to that place for years, drawn to waters where time stops. And now it's finally going to get what it wants. We'll all spend 3 days that last forever, drifting in a moment that never ends. And maybe in a few years, or a few decades, the raft will bring some of us back. Changed, hollowed out, desperate to return to the water. The coordinates are 20 minutes away now. I can see the location on the horizon where the ocean looks different, where reality seems to fold in on itself. The life raft is burning with light, and every crew member who ever drowned is standing at the railings, ready to go home to the timeless waters that claimed them. I'm sealing this account in a waterproof container and throwing it overboard before we cross into that space. If anyone finds it, if this message somehow drifts back to normal reality while the Atlantic Voyager doesn't, you need to know. There are places in the ocean where time doesn't flow correctly, where ships and crews can exist in frozen moments for eternity. And Life Raft Alpha 73 is the doorway. Destroy it if you find it. Burn it. Melt it down to slag. Because it's still out there. Still returning to ships. Still waiting to collect more crew members for whatever exists in the endless ocean where 3 days can last forever. And forever can feel like only 3 days. We're crossing the threshold now. The water is rising up to meet us, defying gravity, reaching with currents that move like fingers. Chen is waving goodbye. Morrison and Okonkwo are in the water below, their heads breaking the surface, smiling as they welcome us home. The sun has stopped moving in the sky. Time has stopped, and we're never leaving. I'd been working as a stage technician on the Mediterranean Pearl for 3 months when I first asked about Section D. The theater seated 800 passengers, but the entire upper balcony on the right side remained dark and empty during every performance. "Why don't we sell those seats?" asked Marcus, the technical director who'd worked the ship for 12 years. Marcus stopped adjusting the lighting rig. Section D stays empty, always. The performers won't go on stage if passengers are sitting there. It's written into their contracts. What kind of superstition is that? The kind based on someone dying. He pulled out yellowed documents from 1993. Samantha Wade, 24 years old, magician's assistant. She died during the finale, crushed by a descending platform that malfunctioned. Equipment failure, they said. But the technician who'd inspected it disappeared 2 days later, just walked off the ship and never came back. What does that have to do with Section D? Marcus showed me crew reports. People started seeing her, sitting in Section D during performances, always the same seat, 3rd row center, always wearing her stage costume. Passengers photographed her even though those seats were never sold. Management stopped selling them because performers refused to work. Every show with Section D occupied ended in disaster. Equipment failures, injuries. The accidents only stopped when those seats stayed empty. That night, working alone to finish lighting repairs, I heard it. Applause. Slow, rhythmic clapping from the empty audience. I turned and saw her. Samantha Wade, sitting in Section D, 3rd row center, wearing sequined costume that caught the light. She was clapping, applauding a performance that had ended 31 years ago. Our eyes met. She stopped clapping and smiled. But it wasn't happy. It was the smile of someone who'd been alone for 3 decades and had just discovered they weren't alone anymore. I ran from the theater, but I could feel her watching every time I returned. Samantha Wade had died during a performance, and somehow she'd never left. And now she'd noticed me. I tried to avoid working alone after that first encounter, but technical rehearsals required someone to operate the lighting board while performers ran through their routines. These rehearsals happened late, usually after midnight when passengers were asleep, and the theater was empty except for essential crew. The first time I saw her during rehearsal was 2 weeks after our initial encounter. I was in the control booth, cueing lights for the dance company's blocking rehearsal. 5 dancers on stage, running through choreography without music. The theater was dark except for my work lights, and I was focused on my console when I felt it. That sensation of being watched. I looked up at Section D. She was there, 3rd row center, Samantha Wade in her sequined costume, sitting perfectly still, her attention fixed on the stage. Not on me this time. but on the performers, watching them with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Do you see her?" It was one of the dancers, a woman named Lisa who'd stopped mid-routine and was staring up at the balcony. "You see her too?" "Third row, section D. She's been there for the past 20 minutes. I thought I was imagining it." Lisa's voice trembled. "She's watching us. Why is she just watching?" I called Marcus on the radio. "We have a situation in the theater. Someone's in section D." "Rachel, I told you that section stays empty." "I know, but there's someone sitting there right now, a woman in a costume. Multiple people are seeing her." Silence on the radio. Then, "I'm coming down. Don't approach her. Don't acknowledge her. Just continue the rehearsal like she's not there." But it was too late. Lisa had already stopped dancing, staring up at Samantha. And the moment their eyes met, every light in the theater flickered and died. Complete darkness. I heard Lisa scream, heard the other dancers scrambling for the exits. Emergency lighting kicked in after several seconds, bathing everything in red. Section D was empty, but on the stage, directly in the spot where Lisa had been standing, was a single sequin, the exact color and shape of the ones on Samantha's costume. I picked it up. It was cold, ice cold, and smelled faintly of smoke and something metallic. Blood, maybe. Marcus arrived and examined the sequin. His face went pale. "She's never left anything physical before. She's getting stronger, more connected to this space." Over the next few weeks, I documented every sighting. Samantha appeared during 7 out of 10 technical rehearsals, always in the same seat, always watching silently. But I noticed patterns. She only appeared when we were rehearsing illusions or magic tricks. Standard musical numbers or dance routines didn't interest her. It was specifically the illusions that drew her attention. Other technicians confirmed my observations. Carlos, the sound engineer, had seen her during a magician's tech rehearsal. She was leaning forward in her seat, like she was trying to figure out how the tricks worked, like she was studying them. Why would she care about illusions? "Because she died during one," Marcus said quietly. "She was part of the trick, the disappearing assistant. Maybe she's trying to understand what went wrong. Or maybe she's looking for a way to complete the illusion she never finished." On the night of the new magician's opening performance, I was running the lighting when I saw her appear during the technical rehearsal. But this time, she wasn't just watching. She was moving, standing up, walking down the aisle of section D toward the stage. Her translucent form became more solid with each step, more real, until she looked almost human. The magician on stage froze. "Who was that? How did someone get into section D?" "Keep going," Marcus ordered through the radio. "Pretend she's not there." But the magician couldn't. He stared at Samantha as she reached the stage, as she climbed the stairs and walked to the exact spot where his collapsing platform was positioned. The same type of equipment that had killed her 31 years ago. She stood on the platform and looked directly at me in the control booth. Then she spoke, her voice somehow reaching me despite the distance. "Show me how it works. Show me the trick that killed me. I need to understand why I'm still here." I spent 3 days in the ship's archives, searching for everything related to Samantha Wade's death. The official report called it equipment failure, but I found handwritten notes from the original investigation that had been buried in old filing boxes. The lead investigator had documented inconsistencies. The hydraulic safety release had been deliberately disabled. The emergency stop button had been disconnected. Someone had sabotaged the equipment. I found the magician's name in the performance records. Victor Kane. His assistant Samantha had been dating the show's producer, and Victor had been in love with her for years. Crew statements mentioned Victor's jealousy, his increasingly erratic behavior during the weeks before the accident. But the investigation had focused on equipment failure rather than foul play because Victor himself had been performing on stage when Samantha died. He'd appeared to be as shocked as everyone else. Except he wasn't on stage when the platform descended. I found rehearsal footage in the archive. Victor had positioned himself behind a curtain during that specific moment of the trick, out of sight, with direct access to the manual override controls for the hydraulic system. He could have triggered the malfunction without anyone seeing. I reported everything to ship security, insisting they reopen the investigation into what was clearly murder, not accident. They dismissed me at first, but I was persistent. I provided documentation, footage, witness statements that had been ignored. Eventually, they contacted maritime authorities in the port where it happened. That night, I went to the theater alone. Samantha was waiting in Section D, more solid than I'd ever seen her. I looked directly at her and said, "I know what he did. I know Victor murdered you. I've reported it. They're investigating. Everyone will know the truth." She stood slowly, and for the first time in 31 years, tears ran down her translucent face. She mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Then she was gone. Section D felt different, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. The oppressive atmosphere that always clung to that balcony had vanished. But 3 nights later, during a performance, I saw her again. Not in Section D. She was on stage standing behind the current magician as he performed, her hands reaching toward his neck. Her face was no longer sad. It was twisted with rage. The magician stumbled, clutching his throat, gasping that something was choking him. Security rushed the stage as he collapsed. When they checked him, there were finger-shaped bruises on his neck. Deep, fresh, impossible. I understood then. Acknowledging the truth hadn't freed Samantha. It had empowered her, given her the validation she needed to stop waiting, stop watching, and start acting. She'd spent 31 years as a passive observer. But now she knew someone believed her story. Someone had confirmed she was murdered. And now she was going to make sure every magician who performed on that stage understood what happened when you kill your assistant. She was going to haunt every illusionist, sabotage every trick, until they all knew her name and her story. The Mediterranean Pearl banned magic acts after that night. But Samantha still appears during performances, standing in the wings, watching the stage with those rage-filled eyes. Waiting for the next person who works with illusions. Waiting to show them the greatest disappearing act of all. The one where the performer vanishes and never comes back. I started working cargo handling on the Pacific Navigator 3 weeks ago, transferring from a container ship where the work was straightforward and predictable. Cruise ship cargo was different. Instead of standardized containers, we handled passenger luggage, supplies, equipment, and provisions for 5,000 people. The storage holds spanned 3 levels below the waterline, massive spaces filled with organized chaos. My supervisor, a Vietnamese man named Tran, who'd worked ships for 20 years, gave me the orientation on my first day. He showed me the upper holds where passenger luggage was stored, the mid-level holds for provisions and supplies, and finally, we descended to the lower hold, the deepest storage area, rarely accessed, where long-term supplies and emergency equipment were kept. "You'll almost never need to come down here," Tran said as we reached the metal door marked Hold 3 lower level. "But if you do, Never enter between 2:30 and 4 a.m. That's critical. You understand? Why? What happens between 2:30 and 4? Tran's expression became unreadable. Metal expansion and contraction. The hull experiences temperature changes, structural stress. It creates sounds, loud sounds, unsettling sounds. But it's just the ship settling. Nothing to worry about as long as you're not down here to hear it. Then why avoid it? If it's just normal ship sounds? Because some sounds, even when you know they're normal, can affect your perception. Make you think you're hearing things that aren't there. Corporate policy is to stay out during those hours for psychological safety. He unlocked the door and let me look inside. The lower hold was enormous, stretching into darkness beyond our flashlight beams. Rows of industrial shelving held supplies wrapped in plastic and secured with cargo straps. The air smelled of metal and oil and something else. Something faintly acrid that made my nose burn. What's that smell? Preservatives, rust treatment. This hold was refurbished 15 years ago and they used industrial-grade sealants. Smell never quite goes away. Tran closed the door and locked it. Remember, 2:30 to 4 a.m. Stay out. Other than that, you're free to access this hold anytime for inventory or supply retrieval. I should have followed his instructions. But 2 weeks into the job, I was assigned overnight inventory duty. Corporate wanted a full accounting of emergency supplies, and the checklist included items stored in the lower hold. My shift started at 11 p.m., and I figured I could finish the lower hold inventory well before 2:30 a.m. I entered Hold 3 at 1:45 a.m., carrying my tablet and flashlight. The space was exactly as I remembered from orientation. Rows of shelving, plastic-wrapped supplies, the acrid smell of sealants. I started my count methodically, scanning barcodes and updating quantities. At 2:28 a.m., I was deep in the hold, maybe 200 feet from the entrance, when I heard the first sound. A low groan, like metal under stress. Tran had been right about the expansion sounds. They were loud, unsettling, the kind of noise that made you think of hull breaches and structural failures, even when you knew it was normal. But then I heard something else underneath the groaning metal. Voices, faint at first, but growing louder, screaming. Multiple people screaming in terror and pain, their voices echoing through the hold with a clarity that couldn't be explained by metal expansion. I checked my watch. 2:30 a.m. exactly. The screaming intensified. It wasn't coming from outside the hold or through ventilation. It was coming from the walls themselves, from the metal hull, as if the screams had been recorded into the steel and were now playing back at specific times. I could distinguish individual voices, men shouting in what sounded like German, women crying, children wailing in absolute terror. And underneath the screaming, rhythmic pounding, fists or tools hammering against metal from the inside. Desperate, frantic pounding that suggested people trapped and trying to escape. The sound surrounded me, coming from all directions, as if I was standing inside a massive drum being beaten from every angle. I ran for the exit, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as the sounds grew louder. The screaming reached a crescendo, hundreds of voices overlapping in a chorus of agony that couldn't possibly be explained by expanding metal or imagination. These were real voices, real screams, real terror somehow preserved in the structure of the ship itself. I burst through the door into the corridor and slammed it shut behind me. The sounds immediately muted, but didn't stop. I could still hear them, faintly, seeping through the sealed door. Screaming and pounding that continued until exactly 4 a.m., when it cut off abruptly, leaving only the normal ambient sounds of the ship's machinery. Tran found me sitting in the corridor, shaking, unable to move. He looked at me with an expression that mixed sympathy with resignation. "You went in during the hours. I told you not to." "What is that?" "That's not metal expansion. Those are people screaming. Hundreds of people." Tran sat down beside me. The Pacific Navigator wasn't always a cruise ship. The hull, the basic structure, it's 79 years old. Built in 1945. Originally constructed as a troop transport vessel near the end of World War II. But it was never used for that purpose. The shipyard where it was built was in Hamburg. It was bombed 3 months before the ship was completed. Direct hit on the construction facility. 317 workers were killed, trapped inside the partially completed hull when the structure collapsed and caught fire. They died inside the ship. They died inside what would become this ship. The hull was salvaged after the war, sold for scrap, then purchased by a shipping company and converted into a cargo vessel. Later refitted as a cruise ship in the 2000s. But the original hull structure, the metal that formed the lower holds, that steel was there when those workers died. And somehow, their final moments were preserved, imprinted into the metal itself. I stared at the closed door. "You're saying the screaming is a recording? An echo of people who died 79 years ago?" "I'm saying the ship remembers. And every night, between 2:30 and 4 a.m., it plays back the worst moments of its history. The company knows. They've had investigators, acoustics experts, metallurgists examining the lower hold. No one can explain it. No one can stop it. So they just made it policy to avoid the area during those hours." Tran stood up and offered me his hand. "Now you know why. And now you'll never go down there during those hours again, will you?" I shook my head. But as Tran led me away from the hold, I couldn't stop thinking about those voices. 317 people who died screaming. Their final moments somehow etched into the metal. And now their ships sailed the oceans, carrying tourists who had no idea they were traveling inside a tomb. Inside steel that remembered death and played it back every night, like a horrific lullaby. I transferred off the Pacific Navigator 2 weeks later. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear them. The screaming, the pounding, the sounds of people who died 79 years ago but are still trapped inside the metal, still crying out, still trying to escape a fire that ended decades ago but never really stopped burning in the memory of the ship itself. I couldn't leave it alone. The sounds from the lower hold haunted my sleep, invading my dreams with screams I couldn't silence. During my breaks, I started researching the Pacific Navigator's construction history, digging through maritime records and shipyard archives available online. Tran had been partially right. The hull was built in Hamburg in 1945, but he'd left out crucial details. The metal hadn't just witnessed death during construction. The steel itself came from another vessel, a German U-boat tender called the Wilhelm Gustloff that had been sunk in the Baltic Sea in January 1945. The sinking was one of the worst maritime disasters in history. Over 9,000 people died when Soviet submarines torpedoed the ship. Most were civilians, refugees fleeing the advancing Red Army. They'd been packed into a vessel designed for fewer than 2,000 passengers. When the torpedoes hit, the ship sank in 45 minutes. The water temperature was below freezing. Survival time was measured in minutes. But what made my hands shake as I read was a specific detail buried in survivor testimonies. Hundreds of people had been trapped in the lower decks when the watertight doors sealed. Standard procedure during submarine attacks. Seal the compromised sections to keep the ship afloat. But on the Wilhelm Gustloff, the doors had sealed too quickly, trapping over 300 sailors and refugees below the waterline. They hadn't drowned immediately. The compartments were airtight. Survivors on the upper decks reported hearing screaming and pounding from below. People trapped in darkness as freezing water slowly filled their prison. The sounds had continued for over 20 minutes before the ship finally went under. No bodies from those sealed compartments were ever recovered. The wreck sat in 250 feet of water, designated a war grave, off limits to salvage. Except someone had salvaged it anyway. In the chaos after the war, the wreck had been illegally stripped for scrap metal. Thousands of tons of steel sold to shipyards across Europe, including the Hamburg facility that built the Pacific Navigator's hull. I found manifests showing the salvaged steel's origin, documentation the company had probably never seen or never wanted to acknowledge. The lower hold of our ship, the section where screaming echoed every night from 2:30 to 4 a.m., had been constructed using metal from the Wilhelm Gustloff's sealed compartments. The very steel that had imprisoned 300 people as they drowned in darkness. The screaming wasn't from the Hamburg bombing. It was from the people who died trapped inside this metal 60 years ago. Their final moments had been absorbed into the steel. And now every night, the ship remembered. Every night, it played back the sound of 300 people drowning in sealed compartments, pounding on doors that would never open, screaming into darkness as freezing water rose around them. I showed my research to Tran. He read through it without expression, then looked at me with tired eyes. Does knowing the truth change anything? Does it make the sounds easier to bear? The company needs to know. This ship is built from a mass grave. Those people deserve acknowledgement. The company already knows, David. Why do you think they have such strict policies about the lower hold? Why do you think they schedule maintenance to avoid those hours? They know exactly what they bought. They just decided the hull was too valuable to scrap, and dead people don't complain about being disturbed. That night, I went back to the lower hold. Not during the screaming hours, but at midnight, before it started. I stood in the center of that massive space and spoke into the darkness. I know who you are. I know you're still here, trapped in the metal. I know you died afraid and alone, and no one ever properly mourned you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The hold remained silent, but the temperature dropped noticeably, my breath forming clouds in air that had been warm seconds before. And in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam, I saw them. Hundreds of translucent figures standing among the shelving, wearing 1940s clothing, their faces showing the terror of their final moments. Men, women, children, all of them drowned, all of them still trapped in the steel that had been their tomb. They stared at me with eyes that held decades of anguish. And then, in perfect unison, they opened their mouths and screamed. After acknowledging them, they became visible everywhere. Not just in the lower hold during the screaming hours, but throughout all the cargo areas, at all times. Figures in 1940s clothing appearing between stacks of supplies, walking through walls that hadn't existed on their original ship, reenacting movements from the night they died. I saw a woman carrying a small child, running toward a door that no longer existed, her mouth open in a silent scream. A sailor turning a valve that wasn't there, trying desperately to seal a breach that had happened 79 years ago. An elderly man pounding on a wall, his fists passing through the modern steel, forever trapped in the moment the water reached his chest. They weren't aware of me or the present. They were recordings, moments of death playing on eternal loop in metal that remembered every second of their drowning. I watched a teenage girl sit down against a bulkhead that hadn't been part of her ship, pulling her knees to her chest as invisible water rose around her. Her lips moved in prayer I couldn't hear. The worst part was realizing the screaming between 2:30 and 4 a.m. was just the loudest moment. The metal was always remembering, always replaying their deaths. Those 90 minutes were simply when their terror had peaked, when the water was deepest, when their screams had been loudest before the compartments flooded completely and silenced them forever. Other crews started seeing them too, once I'd broken whatever barrier had kept them contained. The cook saw a woman in the freezer, drowning in invisible water. A steward found a child hiding in a supply closet, crying for his mother. Each sighting added another witness, another person who understood that the Pacific Navigator wasn't just built from recycled steel. It was built from a mass grave that refused to stay buried. The company tried to contain the reports, offering transfers to anyone who complained. But you can't transfer away from something that's woven into the structure itself. The dead are part of the ship now, trapped in every rivet and beam salvaged from the Wilhelm Gustloff. They'll ride these waves forever, drowning repeatedly in metal that remembers, in steel that absorbed their final screams and will never let them rest. I see them every shift now. Hundreds of figures reenacting their deaths, trapped in the very material of the ship. And every night at 2:30 a.m., I hear them all scream in unison, 300 voices crying out from 1945, begging for salvation that will never come. The Pacific Navigator sails on, carrying tourists who sleep soundly in cabins built above a tomb. And below them, in the cargo holds constructed from salvaged death, the drowned continue their eternal drowning, trapped in recycled steel that remembers everything and forgives nothing. I tried to quit, but every ship in this fleet uses salvaged metal. Every vessel carries ghosts in its structure. There's nowhere to run when the entire ocean is haunted by ships built from graves, when every hull remembers the dead who became part of its foundation. The screaming never stops. It just moves through the metal, following me wherever I go. Because I acknowledged them, I saw them, and now I'm connected to their suffering forever. Another witness to deaths that happened 79 years ago, but never really ended. The metal remembers, and now, so do I.